Call the school board meeting back to order. Welcome all. We'll start with a pledge of allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Welcome, everybody. Hope you all had a good summer. All right. Do we have any comments from the public on any items that are not on the agenda? All right. Do we have any amendments to the agenda? And I have one. I would like to move item 10, evaluation of superintendent, off to our September 7th meeting. Should already be on there. I was hoping that I would have a chance to sit with David before today, and I haven't had a chance to yet, so I think we're in a good place. Just want to move that off. Any other amendments to the agenda tonight? All right. Announcements?
So you have some announcement by your side. Again, we have a lot going on. As the school board knows, we have a series of things going on. Start of the new school year here. New staff orientation has been happening today. Convocation is happening on Thursday. Again, you've had that agenda earlier. Also in front of you, though, is the South Burlington and County Regional Planning Commission and the consulting firm of the VHB are requesting our participation in looking at this Williston Road Network Transportation Study. And so that meeting is on Thursday, September 1st. Again, I'm providing it to you and just letting you know, and you can certainly let me know if you would like to attend. If you want more information, we can certainly ask the city folks for more of that. Again, I think they're looking at, how this impacts geographically for our location and kind of what feeds and how things move in and around our city. So anyway, we have yet to respond. I probably will respond and say I'd like to attend, but just want to make you aware of it.
Okay. Do you need people from the board there, or is that?
It really isn't necessarily that way. I felt like I called it out, that I felt it was an important thing we probably should be paying attention to. Again, it could be that we go there and it's not as relevant, but it certainly seemed to me that something we should be paying attention to, and I thought having a board rep would be good if possible.
Is anyone on the board interested in attending this?
I'm sorry, I missed the date.
September 1st.
11 to 11:30 a.m.
What day of the?
It's Thursday.
It's a Thursday. Yeah, that's hard. Yeah, I can't do that.
Okay.
I'm
Really, really short period of time. I don't know how depth we're
We
going to get in there.
We trust your representation of us.
Yeah, I'll give you some feedback.
Any other announcements, David?
No.
Anything from the board on announcements? All right. Thank you. City and school collaboration. David and I did have an opportunity to meet with Kevin and Helen. We talked about a number of topics. One of the items that we talked about that we wanted to share with this group is we talked about the possibility of having some of the administration team on the school board and the administrative team on the city council work together in some of the early budget planning, particularly on items that might be capital of any kind, to work toward a plan together so that we can communicate with our constituents in a cohesive plan. So we thought that might be an effective use of time. With the board's permission, we can pursue that see how that plays out.
Sounds good.
Sound good?
Sounds great.
Great. Anything you would add to that,
No.
David?
Not on that one. I wanted to also just the steering committee.
Go right ahead.
So I know, again, we're certainly recognizing your busy schedules, but we currently are looking at trying to set up a steering committee meeting for either the 12th or the 13th. A couple of board members have responded back. We're still waiting to hear. So if you could just let Delina know what day works best. We're working with the city to see if we can hone in on one. So 12th or 13th for our first steering committee. We think that's actually a good date. We talked about that just to kind of kick off a number of things that are going on, both city and school.
At what time?
Be 6.
Yeah, and currently, we felt like it was important to have it be a meeting on its own and not be backed up to either a school board meeting or a city council meeting, in hopes that we don't feel rushed and can really spend the time needed on the agenda topics.
Okay.
And connected to that a little bit, we also, I think following the meeting, realized we had forgotten one topic we wanted to chat about, and that was scheduling some legislative breakfasts. So that's in the hopper as well. You'll probably be getting some information on that down the road here.
Great.
And the other thing that we talked about was the feasibility study that they're undertaking on the event center. And I think Kevin, correct me if I'm wrong, David had said that they were a little bit behind schedule. Should be the second week of September or something close to that. I don't know if any. Sound right? That's all I had. Anything you would add?
Nope.
Okay. Superintendent's report?
So I said I would update you on enrollment. Again, it's a little misinformed on the top of the categories, at least in the elementary. It has the end, top category left is end FY, the school year that we just ended. And then there's current as of those dates. So those dates are the dates that are published and what's happened. What we have today is the current as of today, the 23rd, kind of the current situation. Not much change. We have a little change in enrollment at Chamberlain, down from particularly kindergarten. Again, we thought we would be in that mid-40 range. We're now down to 39, and we've made that commitment for 3 classes. So that really has dropped that enrollment number down lower. Other than that, we're holding firm currently in the other areas for the most part at the elementary level, the other class sizes. So we remain watchful. This is, again, still a busy period of time right now. We're in a very busy period of time right now with sometimes late enrollments. Generally, it slows down right now, but, we're still in this place of a little volatility. What I also provided was just enrollments for the high school and the middle school, giving you some previous year information on the second sheet. And then also similar updates to July 22nd, 16th of August, and then today, along with the tuition numbers as well. I'm sure you would like a lot more information. This is kind of just giving you a quick overview. And then the additional pieces is just what I thought would be helpful, was just some of the information that we were provided in the Cropper work, which I know a lot of you have referenced. And you can see under the 16-17 school year, or for that matter, either any year you wish to look at some of how that compares with what was previously published, whole district, and then by each school. I do believe it's a little confusing at the high school level, particularly when you pull in total numbers and the breakout of tuition, and so that's a little cloudy in the high school component. But I just wanted to make sure you were provided with the information, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Questions from the board?
I just want to clarify this a little bit more. So I'm showing that as of the current date, 8/23, we're up 40 students over the prior year actual. The 984 versus the 944.
Mm-hmm.
And that's K through 5. That's accurate?
Yep.
Okay. And that it looked like the actual in prior year was pretty close to the Cropper report, but it's sort of about the same. He or they had 949 for the K through 5 enrollment for this 16-17. Is that the year we're in 16-17?
Yes.
16-17.
Yes.
So 949, and we're at 984, again, as of today.
I'm not sure on your numbers on that one.
Yeah, if you look at, about, on the first page of the Cropper report, if you look at 2016 to 17, total K through 5, it's about 6 lines.
Yeah.
So lines down.
984, you said?
It's
Well,
949.
And that's
So-
compared to your 823 number of 984.
984.
Lots in orchard.
As opposed to the prior year where the actuals were 944 and the Cropper report shows 948, so it's sort of a delta of 4. And the Cropper report was higher than actual, whereas this is a delta of 84.
We're up 3.6% versus what the
The Cropper report.
Cropper report
Yeah.
said.
It's over 30 students additional. And I'm looking at, David, the policy guidelines. I'm seeing the first grade at Central. Is that the only one that's slightly above the policy guideline?
Third grade is 2 now, because that should be 20 or less as well. It's at 21.3 now.
Yep, so you have third grade at
Okay.
21.
It's
Oh, it's
Central.
third grade is that too? I
And
didn't
then
know.
it's
So fourth and
Fourth
fifth
and
is the
fifth,
higher,
yeah,
okay.
fourth and fifth.
And then
So,
Or-
so first and third at Central, and there were no others, is that accurate?
We have Orchard at,
Orchard at
First,
20.3.
20 okay.
Yep.
and then you're close on 24.7 and Orchard at fourth grade. Although the
But as of
policy is
today,
20.
there's sort of 3 that
Yeah,
you,
Right on.
I won't say slightly, but 3 that individual classes that are above the policy guideline.
yeah, and I think, in fairness, you could say you have some that are below, when you get into Chamberlain, we have some that are targeting below, are recommended as well.
But let me also, make clear, the policy guideline,
Is
district.
as it's interpreted, is district. So-
Yeah, and I'm,
so as far as-
and I was just trying to look at
Yeah.
where, I understand
Probably.
that, yeah.
Both.
But, just to be clear, if you look at the bottom, we're not exceeding the policy guideline if you're looking at it as a district average, which is the way the policy is supposed to be read. It's still good to look at individual class cohorts at different
correct.
schools, certainly, but
So in the last week, we lost 4 kindergartners at Chamberlain School. That's pretty amazing. Huh.
And we may
Okay.
gain some,
and gain
Yeah.
a bunch
may lose
of-
some.
But the flip side to that, Julie, is in a period of 2 months, we're up over 40,
Yeah.
which, is there any feedback, David, I think we had this discussion last week to some degree, but do we know where students are coming from?
Well, Mark said he got 24 or something, right,
Yeah,
last week?
25 and a few more.
Yeah.
We really haven't broken down the geographic. I did sense the board some kind of mapping, coding there, and we'll update that again. It would be nice to be able to mark perhaps an even, some other identifier that shows the newest to our district and moving in.
Yeah.
We don't know generally where it's, affordability. We've definitely seen an uptick in the Orchard area, the Odell Parkways. That they definitely have seen a little more uptick there into our grades. But it's also been spattering around. It's just been that Orchard, as you can see, in that number is seen pretty significant increases, or an increase in their student enrollment.
And based on your experience, David, what kind of variance have we had to the forecasts over the years? Is it, less than 0.5%? or-
Specific to forecasts, Cropper forecast,
Yeah.
or?
We really only have a year of experience.
Yeah, and I have previous history of, and I was actually looking at that previous history with Bill Smith's work that we did on enrollment, and I was just charting that out. We went out to 16, 17, and he was remarkably pretty close with a high level of variance in some areas, although there was some areas that really off, really, some classes were really off in predicting much smaller enrollment, and we've had a much larger increase in some specific grades. So I would hesitate to say right now that I've studied a lot of the variance currently going on with demographic tracking, at this point.
So they were spot on for last year as a whole. The grades were different, like the distribution across the grades was different than what it had been. We were minus 0.4%, so we were off by 5 students last year, based on the updated.
Generally, I mean, I would say in the on years, particularly after a demographic study, there should be high correlation to accuracy in the years in which we have students in the system, you know?
Yeah,
Right?
right.
It's the out years, you know, in particularly in forecasting beyond numbers of years that we've seen those greater fluctuations. And again, obviously on the bookends, you know, the kindergarten and our tuition students have certainly had the highest level of volatility, although, you know, we've gotten better.
Thanks.
Any other questions on this topic?
I will keep this on the agenda. I think it's an important issue, you know, for us to just keep you posted on where I'm at with enrollments and what's going on and how we're accommodating our students in all grades. So I'll keep it on the
Yeah.
next agenda as well.
Perfect. That moves us to, oops, wrong agenda. Master planning and visioning. So we've got a pretty robust section here on master planning and visioning. I want to frame it a little bit, and then if the board members would like to frame it a little bit more, obviously I'll leave that open. We've had 2 subcommittees that have been working pretty diligently over the summer on 2 specific topics, the educational value component and the financial and real estate component and capacity as well. And then we've got some reports on community feedback that we wanted to share tonight as well. We don't have this warrant for any kind of action tonight. This is a formal kind of reporting out of those 2 subcommittees. We expect at the end of this, I expect, I should say, that at the end of this conversation tonight and this reporting out, that we'll kind of figure out the next steps as a group. We have talked a little bit about potentially having a positional statement on the September 7th meeting, so we'll kind of validate whether or not we think we can do that or not at the end of this conversation. These 2 reports are, for the benefit of the board, really deeper dives into 2 areas where the board felt like we needed a little more information and a little more education about what we thought about the financials, the capacity, and the educational value pieces. They are not the only 2 pieces of data that we'll end up using to make a recommendation. There's the task force report, the minority report, there's all the other inputs that we've been getting, including the community feedback that will all be used. And I'm not going to try to mention all of them here today, but that's what we'll be doing moving forward. I think that's really how I wanted to frame that. Would anybody like to add anything before we start the committee reports to that framing?
I would just like to encourage everyone who's here and anyone that you talk to respond to what you hear tonight, because there's a very short period of time between now and when we're actually going to be making our individual statements about what we think we should do moving forward. It's kind of the last call for feedback before we come out and say, this is what each of us thinks on this topic. That doesn't mean it's the final, decision, but it would be helpful to have any further input that anyone wants to provide once you've seen the additional work that we've done over the summer.
I think that's going to have to be part of our conversation about the time frame between now and the September 7th. That may be too short.
The other thing I will add is that we had worked with White and Burke on some financial analysis, and we had provided them feedback on their report, which they presented to the public. And they have, as of today, kind of given us the final version of that. So that's available for the community as well. I know the board has read this, and there's not major changes to that, but obviously we'll all read that again. That'll be posted as well as these reports on our website, David, by tomorrow, probably fair to say?
I'm not going to commit to
All right,
exactly
fair
tomorrow,
enough.
as soon as we possibly can.
There you go. I won't pin you
But
down.
We will definitely get them up as soon as we can.
Great.
I would ask what board members are speaking. I know some people, it's a little bit harder to hear. I probably should have had some amplification in here tonight, so if you could just be conscious about speaking up if you can. Some people, I know it's hard to hear. Folks are certainly invited to move up too if you want, so you can hear better.
So what I'd like to do is, we're going to cover the educational values first. I'm going to cover part of that. Martin was on that committee with me, and Martin will cover the other part of that. I'll ask the board for comments and questions as we finish that, and then I'll open it up to the public for comments and questions related to that. Before we start, as we framed it and kind of set up kind of what we think the next steps are, do we have any comments from the public at this point that we want to entertain? Okay. All right. So the Master Planning and Visioning Educational Benefits of Configurations report is available on the table, and as David said, it'll be available on the web relatively soon. I'm not going to read the entire report. I'm going to try to cover a couple of highlights of what we tried to accomplish with this, and then Martin, I believe, is going to augment that if he chooses and bring in the summary data that we talked about. I will read the opening paragraph because I think that's an important paragraph. The South Burlington Board of School Directors formed a subcommittee in March of 2016 to review the educational benefits of the 5 proposed reconfiguration options for the district's elementary schools. The subcommittee reviewed the Master Planning and Visioning Task Force report, the Task Force Minority Statement, input provided by the administration, and research provided by the administration and community members. Although primarily deferring to the findings of the task force and the expertise of the administration, the subcommittee also conducted some limited additional research on certain narrow questions. In addition, the subcommittee asked several questions of the administration related to its conclusions to understand fully its rationales and conclusions. So the first question that we really posed to ourselves was which configuration would put the district in the best position to continue offering the current educational programming. In that section, I will not read that verbatim, we speak to the strengths of our current system and some of the goals that we think we wanted to articulate about that. Ensuring the schools can continue to offer their exemplary education programming and the continued rising cost of education reflected in our annual budgets and increases combined with the flat enrollment trends, not forgetting what we just saw about enrollment at the elementary school. And then we talked about some risks associated with debt service payments and the lack of flexibility that then brings to bear if we pursue an option like that. And as well as some of the opportunity costs and the community's capacity to pay for any of these things that we are talking about. And it's much more robust than that, but that's the high-level summary of that. And then the second major question that we talked about was what are the educational benefits to be gained through reconfiguring options, which are largely the options of 3, 4, and 5. We spent some time talking about the value of the physical space in the form of 21st century learning spaces, primarily within option 4s and 5, and the difficulty that we had in quantifying the specific extent of those benefits to the education. And I also believe we talked a little bit about the fact that it's not obviously just the space, it's how we go about our practices in those spaces that is ultimately very critical to how we do our work. And there's some research cited and some points made about the physical space not being the only consideration, but the technology and teaching practices. We talk about the academic opportunities that might be able to be brought to bear in various configurations, including the examples of language and music, and the cost scenarios that might be under play under the various scenarios there. We talk about access to extracurricular programs and how that plays out, and the fact that in our elementary schools now we have extracurricular programs that might vary from school to school, and we talk about the pros and the cons and the likelihoods of how those might move forward in an environment where there is one elementary school or some other combination compared to what we have today. We talk about diversity and how that is impacted by moving to one school cohorts, where some school students may have more diversity and other students may have less diversity, and how that would play out over time. We talk about how the increased diversity can improve educational experiences a little bit. And we talk a little bit about the marginal difference that we see that might be bringing in. Similar things in equity. The relevant issue related to equity relates to the inconsistent class size in our particular scenario and how the various scenarios may or may not impact that scenario. We talk about the value to students that comes through with improved teacher collaboration. And how having educators for a single grade in a single space where they might be able to collaborate better as a value and how that plays out. And we cite some research there that might be applicable to that scenario. We talk about how we're trying to do a really good job with collaboration now, but logistically just creates some challenges in that environment. We talk about transitions primarily under option 4 and the value of transitions in certain situations and allowing students to reinvent themselves, and also the stress that puts on our students when we have them transition more than they would ideally need to do. And how one of the factors in transitions is related to their peer groups, and how, in certain scenarios that we could choose, that those peer groups would remain the same, i.e. option 5 or option 4. And then we spent some time talking about school size and the challenges related to a consolidation environment where all our students would be in one school, and how small learning communities could be brought to bear to help mitigate some of those. And we talk a little bit about the leadership. Well, I'm not sure if we specifically talk about the leadership. We talk about the fortitude that would have to do to change our practices to make that small learning environment really what we want it to be. I think that's probably a pretty robust kind of summary of some of the areas we talked about, although it's not robust enough to explain each piece. Why don't I let Martin kind of add anything he wants to those points, and then maybe cover the summaries that we identified.
Yeah, I guess I think that's fine. I think folks just need to read what we have that we put into this report to understand more of the details rather than bogging down in that right now. But I do want to make a point, which we make actually in the summary, and I will go over each of the options in a moment, or at least option 2 through 5, and how the different educational benefits play out with each of those options. But a main point that we, I think, found in this process is that there are educational benefits, certainly, that are identified. One of the frustrations is that the extent of those educational benefits, they're not clear. There's a judgment call to be made in this. There's not research that we could find, or that the administration provided, or that the task force looked at, that could really explain what value of the 21st century learning, or collaboration, or increased diversity, how is that going to affect the educational outcomes? And going from that point A to point B is not clear. So there are some judgment calls, and we do certainly look to the administration in helping us, but we're all going to have to look at what we have and see if we have learned enough about the educational benefits to justify any of these particular options. So, and that's really explained in the page 12 and 13, where we talk in the summary about how one can't really, or it's possible mathematically to determine educational benefits of different initiatives, but that information is just not available for a lot of the benefits that we've, and the administration primarily, has identified for us. So in any event, with respect to option 2, which is essentially the status quo, but with some basic maintenance and renovations that would occur, that would not include 21st century learning space renovations as it's currently set forth for our consideration. None of the benefits that we had identified would really be achieved through this implementation of option number 2. But on the other hand, there is, looking at the educational benefits that the new configurations would provide, and what our first section of this report also really highlights is ensuring that we're not jeopardizing or accepting more risk than we should with respect to continuing our programming that we have right now. In other words, if we have a fixed cost for a particular option, a fixed cost of debt service, that's something that would have to be paid. And if we run into budget difficulty, we will have to pay that fixed cost still, but we will jeopardize or have to cut potentially some of the other programming. So that's a risk that we have to keep in mind. And related to that is the extent that we invest in the elementary school will detract potentially, again, it's not for sure, the ability to do the upgrades that we believe are necessary in the middle school and high school. So option 2 does the most for avoiding that risk. Although it does not give us the additional educational benefits that what I will call the consolidation options provide. Option 3 would consolidate into two existing elementary schools, Central School and Orchard, and Chamberlain would be closed and sold. There wouldn't be renovations necessarily at the elementary schools for 21st century learning spaces, although there might be, just basic renovations that would occur. And this particular consolidation option does provide some of the advantages. It does allow the administration to more cost-effectively expand instruction in language in second languages and also music instruction. It also does provide some additional ability to offer a broader range of extracurricular programs. It does allow us the administration some more ability to manage the class sizes, having just two schools instead of 3. And it also helps for collaboration among teachers, because there would be at least four teachers per cohort, rather than between 2, 3, and sometimes 4, as we currently have now. Option 3 also does help us as far as risk with respect to the fixed costs. Option 4 is the consolidation into 2 elementary schools, one of them being new. Kindergarten through 2nd grade would be at Orchard, and 3rd through 5th would be at a new facility that would have 21st century learning. And this would really, the benefits that would be gained in this option would primarily go to the new facility and the 3rd to 5th grade, where one could arguably say that's it's more beneficial than the higher elementary grades to have the 21st century learning spaces, to have the language and music, at least pushing it down 3 more grades from what we have right now. And we also believe that it would improve as far as the ability, certainly would give us the best ability, along with option 5, for equity. And when I say equity, it means having consistent class sizes for all the students, as opposed to ranging from 18 to 25 kids that we currently have for one of our grades among the 3 classes. Option 5 also provides along with option 4, the best ability to have collaboration among teachers, to have equity in classroom size, and also provides the best ability for expanding most cost effectively, at least the ongoing costs, not necessarily weighed against the fixed cost of debt service, but with respect to additional programming that we could have, as well as extracurriculars. There is a downside certainly with option 5, which we recognize, and that is with respect to the size of the school and the uncertainty that we have with respect to whether small learning communities would really work to address the issues with respect to size. We just, on that particular issue, we did not find and really haven't been provided with information that shows whether the small learning communities is something that would work in a very large elementary school. There are studies with respect to, as I understand it, high school or middle school, but that's not the issue that's before us. And we do have the issue, which I skipped, with respect to option 4, which is the additional transition would have to be a trade-off. So that's where we are. I mean, again, there was some frustration that it couldn't be more definitive. Wish it was more definitive, but it's not, and we do have to weigh. There's certainly benefits that we see in the various options. Option 5 with one elementary school Certainly gives us more of the benefits we've identified, but also has one of the negatives, certainly, of a very large school. I will also comment once again, this is something Patrick alluded to, that this doesn't take, we really looked at the educational benefits. And at the end of this report, we do highlight some of the areas that we understand are very important for any decision, such as the impact to community, impact to neighborhoods, safety issues, and some other issues. But we were really looking directly at educational outcomes, or what could affect educational outcomes in this report. And I do need to clarify one point actually in this report, which is at the very end of the report. There's a suggestion that the board would make a recommendation, and depending on its recommendation, we would then look at the impacts to neighborhood, communities, and outside pressures to Chamberlain and such. And that wasn't the intent here. I think before the board makes a decision, those are other factors that we will be considering, but it was not part of this report. So we will be considering those other factors before we would make a decision. It wouldn't be post hoc after we've made a decision on which configuration we prefer. So I'll stop droning on.
Questions at this point from the board?
Can you expand a little, Martin or Patrick, on the small learning communities? You said were there data presented on middle and high school and just no data available on elementary? Or I want to just get clarification. Oh, sorry, I asked a question about the small learning communities, if there was information specific to elementary schools.
There wasn't specific to elementary schools. I recall that there may have been for high school and middle school. I didn't look closely at those because they weren't on point. I don't, Patrick, if you...
No, I agree with that. We were not able to locate any evidence at this point that was specifically addressing elementary school.
Are there recommendations being made by administrators and educators that is a viable option at the elementary level? Small learning communities?
You want to answer that one, David?
Sure. I mean, the answer would be yes. I mean, it's a critical component. I will tell you that, research is highly driven around middle and high school to create essentially small learning communities, which are the impetus for what has built up what is our elementary schools. Our elementary schools are examples of small learning communities. Self-contained classrooms, typically in the size of, 17 to 20, in our lower elementary, a little bit higher in the upper elementary. But they're self-contained classes, small learning communities that travel through time in a school day, through their programming, is an example of small learning communities. That coupled with, in some cases, collaborative time, across the hallway currently, or sometimes next door. Those are the small learning communities that really are in play. Typically across the country in elementary schools, they are the emulator of small learning communities. Now, clearly, when we look 21st century, that expands to have other spaces that are in direct locations where you can further collaborate and further exercise skills that allow for, again, the STEM kind of components and expanding really those small learning communities that we talk about. So when we look for research, and again, we did some of that work on behalf of Martin and Patrick on some of this work, but you're not going to find a lot. You're going to find a lot on the environment of elementary schools, and a lot more trying to emulate that at middle and high school.
And correct me if I'm wrong, there was something, and I should have looked it up, there was something in either the task force report or the minority report to the task force report that said small learning communities are a way of making a bigger school feel smaller if you've already sort of got a bigger school, but that it was not ideal really to build a bigger school and then build small learning communities. If you've already got small learning communities, you've kind of got the thing that you're after, and that it's not really all that efficient to build a bigger school to then try to make it feel smaller by doing something like that. So I don't remember where that reference came from, but it was one of the
Yeah.
bibliography items and one of the other
Well, I mean, I
report
think there's a
items.
lot of, I mean, and I want to be careful, this is your opportunity to converse,
Yeah.
I'm trying to answer that question.
Mhm.
You know, I do think, you're right, Bridget, that if you just build a big school and then try to create, ideal, small learning communities in 21st century spaces, that's difficult.
Mhm.
However, if it's something that if it's grade specific in one of your options, you're building a new facility, you want to have that in mind where you can create the expanded learning, small learning community with spaces like maker spaces that really allow that to be, an extremely positive learning experience. There are examples, we have some examples with our neighbors to the south at Shelburne, for example, that's a K-8 and a little over 800, and they're currently going through a fair amount of this type of work in renovating and small learning spaces and maker spaces currently that, is a good example of a large school, but small learning communities and what we're talking about, some of the 21st century or maker spaces. So, anyway, enough said.
I recall the reference as well, Bridget, so I think I definitely concur that was said.
Unless anyone has anything else on that, I guess my question goes back to 21st century learning and what that really looks like for an elementary school student specifically versus a middle or a high school student. What are the real needs for 21st century learning for those students? And I'm still just not clear how it looks different than what we're providing the students now, and whether there's a dramatic change that's needed for elementary school students, or whether it's a little add-on to what we're doing now. I don't know if Martin or Patrick or David, if you have sort of a vision of, how the education we're providing now, how the curriculum would really change for 21st century learning, specifically for the elementary level.
So I'll start. I don't have a specific answer to that question. I mean, it's hard to kind of get that deep into the specifics of how we're teaching today and how that would change tomorrow. We really did rely on the kind of the research that we were trying to find to see if there was value in moving to the 21st century. We didn't really dig into the specifics of what are the actual practical day-to-day changes that would be put in place in the school. I don't know, Martin, do you have anything you'd want to add to that?
Well, I mean, that goes back to kind of one of the frustrations that it was hard to, I could see there could be value, but nothing could really, there isn't anything out there as far as I can tell, or was, I didn't do a bunch of research, but administration in answering my questions and the task force as well, there's not a lot that tells you, well, what extent of the value that you're going to get from 21st century.
Right.
And that's why, I mean, we don't come out and say, this is, this is great, and we're going to get 3 months worth of additional learning per year by doing this, because it's not there. So, and that is difficult. I mean, that's why it's a judgment call and just hearing from administration on where that goes, but.
Yes, do I have a vision? Absolutely. I mean, I spent some time with the Business Association this morning, and a huge component of what we know is important is around student engagement. I'm very confident currently that we're doing a lot of the right things on the curriculum that we're providing, in our mathematics and our science. But one of the things that I'm really, sensitive to is around the student engagement. And I do believe we have to look much more strongly at ensuring that students are engaged. It's difficult to take a classroom that we currently have today and to allow to talk about, hydraulics and in any component of the opportunity to touch, see, and allow for things to happen, whether it's science in motion, whether it's, literature and action. When we have limited space, we have good spaces, but we're limited to expand in a 21st century way to create higher level engagement for our students. And in the 21st century learning environment, in a self-contained type of situation, elementary school, there are vibrant examples of engagement and reinforcement of the content we're teaching in such a significant way. Again, I haven't had the opportunity to work in those spaces, but I have had the opportunity to visit some of those spaces. And I think to Martin's point, they're not quantifiable. I can't tell you that if we were to do this, or create these spaces in our current existing spaces or schools, that we would see exponential X% increases. But I do believe strongly that we would create higher level of engagement. We would create a higher level of excitement for kids. And this is not only at the elementary level. This is also articulated all the way through high school, and what I was sharing with some of the business folks around creating more relevant experiences, hands-on experiences for our students, to put to practice the content in which we're teaching. So it is hard. I mean, I'm somewhat frustrated, not at you, but I'm frustrated in our ability to provide, heavily researched practices on the gains of what 21st century spaces is. I do think it would be important, as we continue, the opportunity to look at some of those spaces and to see some of them in motion might be helpful to some folks as well.
And that's what I was wondering, is there like an anecdote even, that you could provide about a 21st century space in an elementary school and how they were using that space really to provide something different than what we're providing? I mean, just one example, like a science class or any class, really, just so that I have a better understanding.
Yeah, I think I can certainly provide
Okay,
that to you.
okay.
I think it would be better that it come right from, a classroom teacher that maybe has some, this is the way I for years I had it and now I have it, and this
Yeah.
would be what I would say,
Okay.
And again, probably there's some opposition to that too, I suppose. I can't believe that, but I'm certainly happy to do that in concert with you folks, just to do some of that. And I use Shelburne as an example. They similarly, although a little farther ahead, have been having some of the similar dialogue around this type of learning, this type of practice, and this type of conversation around how to create that. So I can certainly give you some of those anecdotal feedback.
Okay.
And I guess just real quick, follow up, is that the research that we looked at, that David had provided us, did cover elementary school through middle school and high school as far as it being beneficial. And explained that it was beneficial. I mean, there was one report that explained a percentage, but I don't think we know enough about the factors of the situation there to put a lot of stock in it. But there's a benefit there. And unfortunately, it's something that nobody has quantified
Right.
out there.
And I guess I'm pushing less on the benefit, because I can kind of see the benefit. The question is, for me, at the elementary level, how drastically different do our spaces need to be to get some of that benefit? If it's even just a portion or all of that benefit, do they really need to be dramatically different? And like an anecdote, about how the spaces would need to be different would be helpful. An anecdote about how they wouldn't would also be helpful, just so we sort of have some kind of parameters around what we're talking about. I just feel like it's been so vague, other than showing us, pictures, beautiful pictures of other schools that have these spaces. I guess my question is just really, if we agree that 21st century learning is where we need to go, what do we actually need to do to get there, or to at least get part of the way there, and then look at the costs and say, okay, here's the benefit we're after, and here's what the actual cost is. I guess I'm just struggling to get my brain around the actual costs. Stephanie put up very big numbers about that. There were very big numbers in the task force report, and when you dig under them, they're very high level. They're not sort of, this is the space that we would need at Chamberlain. This is the space that we would need at Orchard if we were to retrofit. It's broader than that. And so I guess my question is, how can we try to extract some of those benefits of 21st century learning without some of those high costs? Or do we really need to accept that we do have to build those spaces in order to get those benefits?
Right. And I think that we hit on that point at the end of the section, talking about 21st century learning, where we say, the question is whether investing a significant sum in physical space is the best use of the community's education dollars, or whether we should pursue more modest upgrades to existing structures to obtain some of the benefits of 21st century learning spaces, along with increased investment in the other factors of 21st century learning. And that's the big question. And I say, unfortunately, there's not research or evidence to do a lot to help us answer that question.
I think we see a glimpse of how elementary school would benefit from that, even in central school in the 5th grade with the project room and how they move into that space as a group, on a regular basis. There's more space and there's more opportunity for them to do that. And I think I think that's just my baseline there is what I've seen, but, you know, that's pretty compelling.
Other questions from the board? If the board wants to process for a minute, I can ask for the community questions, if that's acceptable.
That'd be great.
We'll start with that. Yes, ma'am.
I've attended all the meetings. In the first meeting I attended, I raised the same questions that I have tonight. I feel that the emphasis on 21st century learning and architecturally designed new places is a very risky will-o'-the-wisp. You don't know exactly what you're talking about, and that's admitted. You can't tell how the new spaces will affect the children or the teachers, but you're hoping for the best. And I feel that the advantages that you were conceiving of happening, such as equity, you are measuring that in a handful of children enrolled. And I also object to diversity being considered a gain if you increase the numbers and you have a larger group to divide up. I don't think these will lead to educational accomplishments. I feel that Oxford and Cambridge are operating with architectural creations dating to the 12th and 13th century. And I believe in putting resources with teachers, children, parents, community that will support the activities of the school district.
Thank you very much for your comment. Any other comments or questions?
Wonder if there's been consideration to different models of personnel utilization to accompany any structural changes, given that structural changes won't make any difference unless there are changes in personnel utilization and consideration of that and development.
So we didn't cover that in the educational report. There is some information in the financial model about changes in staffing, but I don't think that answers your question as well. David, do you have any short response to that at this point? No? All right. Any other board member have a response to that question? So what we'll do is we'll take that question, we'll add it, we've added a list of questions from the community, so we'll add that to our list. Thank you. Tim?
Yeah, I just want to respond that from the media reports that I read about Shelburne, when they put their bond up for a vote, it was to take care of some building deficiencies, and one of the main ones was that they had adopted an open classroom type architecture from a mode of education from a while ago. And it wasn't successful because there was too much noise, and it was time to probably try and finally encapsulate distinct rooms to, subdivide the children and get some noise protection. So in that sense, where they had large open rooms and they're able to subdivide them, that's a much more, easily accomplished thing than having to go try to retrofit or if you already have a school that has distinct rooms and has noise control, I don't see the benefit to having to try and deal with that by building a whole new school. So Shelburne, if they were going to try and implement a 21st century, design model for their classrooms, they have the benefit of starting with an open classroom in an existing structure. And we don't know if that's going to benefit them or not, other than reducing the noise.
Thank you.
And I wasn't trying to draw a correlation of exact unification between our two schools. I was simply wanting to articulate that a conversation similar to what you have been having, they have been having. And Tim's right, their structures are different than your structures. But the point being is that they've had the conversations and they're working towards a resolve that I think is similar to what you're looking at around being mindful of cost, being mindful of learning spaces, being mindful of enrollment, being, all of those things factored in. So, again, they're not the only example too. There's many in Vermont and there's many currently in the country that are going through some similar things. And I just was highlighting that as an example, as a near neighbor, that there's always opportunities to listen to them and learn a little bit.
Yes, sir.
Excuse me. Dan Albrecht, Proctor Avenue, 2 daughters in high school. It's good to see the analysis and sort of a pause, this kind of, I know the pause, but just further exploration of the issues at hand. It's good to see the demographic information. It's only 2 years worth of data, but that's very useful because I think people always have sort of questions about that, you know, and not to say that they're far off, but it's interesting to see things holding relatively steady. One of the key things, we can't look at South Burlington in a bubble. There's a lot of stuff happening statewide around education. And unlike, because we have a statewide funding school system, under old models it was, well, we don't want to have too many houses or whatever, or people, because then our school budget will bust. But under the Vermont model, you want students. You get that money with them. And so given what's the discussion in the islands that they're dealing with about what might happen there, given the continued decline of rural Vermont with viable economies, no stagnant population, or declines in populations in some counties, and given the reputation of South Burlington schools, I think there's maybe it's just a couple of paragraphs that notes these issues going on. It can't come to really hard conclusions, but that's a little outside input that's always coming in regardless of just crunching the demographic numbers. So just something to think about, because I read this Vermont Digger every day about Act 46 and all this stuff, and what's going on in Burlington schools. And that's something I think you guys are aware of. It would just be nice if the next white paper you do or update touches on some of these factors, because I think it's not going to go away, and people around the state know it. For better or for worse, it's happening.
Great. Thank you. Appreciate your comment.
Can I comment
Yes.
back on that? Just a comment about that is that I think we take that into account somewhat in 2 areas that we've looked at. One is this first section where, and what I talked about a little bit about it, the risk of taking on fixed cost of debt service. And given there's a lot of uncertainties on what's happening statewide for education, you know, it may come to our benefit at some point, you know, but still it's unsettled right now. So that's why that we've mentioned. And I know that in the report that Bridget and Elizabeth worked on, there's a question of making sure we have enough space in whatever configuration we have. And that's another place where we're taking into account that risk. So we've done that a little bit. I just want to point that out, but I appreciate you talking about those bigger issues.
Abby?
I don't know if you mentioned this earlier before I walked in, but you said tonight you're reporting on these items listed here on the agenda, and then you'll have individual statements and then a board decision. What's the timing for that?
So what we said at the beginning, I think before you came in, is that if we're done this, we're going to have a conversation about what the timing looks like for that.
Like another year or like another 6 months?
Well,
We said
after
we're
we get
gonna-
through these committee reports, we're going to have that conversation, and I'll be able to answer your question. I don't think it's a year. Yes, sir.
Art Klugo, a resident, former task force member. Just a couple of questions, and actually there are more observations about the report. A lot of good work in bringing together the various sources that you've had to look at. It's clear that you've stumbled across the challenge here, which is education is as much art as it is science. And I would certainly offer in looking at that and trying to reconcile that, maybe look at where the business community is going. Look at what Google's doing. Look at what Ford's doing. Look what these companies are asking of their employees. And we should be asking the same questions on how we prepare our children to live in that world. It's a very fast-paced, changing environment that they're being required to adapt to at a much quicker pace. This is an opportunity to do that. The question about whether or not there's any value at the K through 3 or K through 5 level for 21st century learning, think about our own experiences. The earlier we're exposed to something, the more adaptable we are in that environment. Doesn't matter whether it's technology or education, whatever it is that we do, it becomes second nature to us, and we can concentrate on other things that are more important that we shouldn't have to go back and try to learn. The information that David shared was spot on in terms of some of the relationships there. So I would just offer that for consideration as you try to grapple with this idea of as a measurable, this metric that you're holding on to make a decision. That metric does not exist. But in our experiences, certainly there are examples out there that provide us the direction that we need to go to. A couple of other points that I just want to leave you with. One is on the educational, or the educator desires. Certainly from the task force, both Holly Ruel and Cindy Tan echoed the benefits of the 21st century living model. And just personally, I respected the positions that they landed in, because where they came into that task force and what they saw education to be and where they ended up was night and day. They went through almost a year-long process. They were given a lot of information. They had their own personal experiences as educators, and came out believing that 21st century learning was a place that their students would benefit from. That wasn't shown here, but that is certainly something that came out of the task force work. David hit on this. I just want to reinforce this, that building a big school and trying to convert it into small learning communities is not the right way to do that. You design the school to support the small learning communities, and it will be beneficial, and it will support 21st century learning. If you're worried about the budget and you think the community can only afford so much, establish the budget and work backwards and find the benefits that we can support with that budget, rather than trying to work forward. In the world that I live in, the construction world, we call that the last planner model. You get much more benefit for your dollar than you do trying to start at the beginning and work forward. Start at the end and work backwards, and you'll get some really good outcomes on that. And then lastly, I would just suggest that we have a 5-year window to retire the debt, as it was explained to us on the existing schools. And I don't remember the dollar value there. I think it was close to $9 million. So the opportunity before you is to find a way to retire that debt, redeploy that capital in a way that our students will be better prepared in the future in the businesses and the careers that they'll have as they go forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Art. Any other questions?
I guess, just kind of going on what Art just said here, so, hold on, let me just get my thoughts here. I guess, for me, the hydraulics in first grade or second grade, as a former first and second grade teacher, with an open classroom, which we put walls up in because it was too loud, and we were able to work with our principals to find other spaces to collaborate and do group work. But to have hydraulics and being able to show them that in those young grades it's truly unnecessary. Our teachers are doing that. They have expensive science kits that everyone's bought. And they're being shown light and weight and all these different unique science components and other things. But the bottom line is there's a lot of kids that are really struggling. And my son's one of them. And getting support is really hard. Those reading specialists and the math specialists aren't always working with students. So we have a lot of things going on, and I'm really grateful. I've gotten a really great working relationship with teachers and those some of the literacy supports, but there are a lot of other kids in the class that aren't getting help. And so I would love to have my kids be exposed to other things at that young age. But I also want them to read first and be able to do basic math. And those are the concrete blocks that they need in a shoebox, like Julie's spoken to before. They could learn in a barn. But once you get into middle school, that's when you're still really young and you still can be exposed to cool things. And in high school, but not necessarily in the elementary school. We have so many wonderful things already taking place there that do need some tweaking in terms of support and how those teachers that are not directly working with students, how their time is being used. And I think we need to be looking at that and the money that we're putting into the current budget and not being thinking about all these extra wonderful things, because there's a lot of other things that are wonderful happening in the schools, but a lot of things that are really hard. And I don't think we need a special classroom for any of that, and I certainly will not support that.
Thank you very much for your comment. Yes, sir.
Question for you. White and Burke put together the estimates that are in this report.
Correct.
Do you know what program they use for estimating? It's a technical question, like means is a standard program. the
I'm going to look over to the
consultants
committee
use.
that did the financial analysis, see if they know the answer. to that.
No, I mean, the only report that we got directly from, the estimates that they did, that we got, in terms of what real estate could be sold for and those kinds of things, were inputs to the Excel financial model that they gave to us. So what we got from them had inputs of things like that. We weren't exposed to any of sort of the technical programming that went into some of the assumptions that they put into the model that they gave to us.
And I think they built the program.
sorry?
It's my understanding that they built.
They built the financial
They built
spreadsheet.
the
There's a
spreadsheet.
spreadsheet, yeah, it's a very detailed workbook,
Yeah.
Excel workbook.
To work on estimates
Right.
based on the size of the building, the
Right.
square footage, what kind of site you're building on, that affects a lot of the costs.
Yeah.
You would be fa-
Art, do you have
not
an
done yet.
observation on this?
Yeah, so to answer your question,
Okay.
we had the similar numbers from the task force was given. There was given, the work was done by an architecture firm and a construction manager jointly. Those numbers were then given to the task force, which I believe are the same numbers that were incorporated in the White and Burke report. So there were outside professionals, construction and design professionals that were generating those numbers that we used and that they used.
So that's available?
Those numbers are embedded in the reports. I don't know, we did not receive the Excel spreadsheets on how they put the numbers together. There are no complete designs, so there are not
Yes,
the
that's one of the.
detailed estimate that you're
Right.
probably looking for.
Yeah, I understand that. I didn't want to get into that, but it's seat of the pants square footage at this point.
Yes.
For some of the stuff that you're doing, okay?
Yes.
And the reality, when you start designing, is going to be different. That's my only point. I would just want to ask to see if there was an estimate that I could look at, but
Okay.
I think you've helped me with what you've just said. It's kind of twined into the whole deal right now. I'm not sure you could really look at that kind of estimate.
I appreciate your question, thank you. Yes, ma'am.
I noticed something else in just glancing through all of the papers that stated that the board has an obligation to consider the potential buyers who are shopping for property in South Burlington. I'd like to pose my objection to that. I don't think a school district is obligated to offer up its facilities that have been built over a number of decades and generations because someone thinks it's a good real estate location for some other purpose. I think repurposing of school properties is notoriously unsuccessful. Those properties have more value, but the value that they have is for schools and education. I also think the business community should turn to education rather than the other way around to see what kind of citizens you hope to emerge from the schools.
I appreciate your comment, thank you.
Can I just follow up on that, Gene? I think the point we were making there is we have to understand that if we are going to move towards a new facility or upgrading facilities and we're going to sell a facility, we should be aware of when we may have the best demand situation. You know, if now is the time we would be able to get the most for a school building, you know, that's just part of the calculation. That's not going to, you know, that we can get $10 million or whatever, now we're going to go ahead and sell. Now, that's not the way we're looking at it, is if we're going to make a decision to renovate or to sell a school, we look at the timing. So that's all that I think point was what we were trying to make there, so.
Tim?
I just have to say that there are 3 city councilors here now. We're not discussing city business. There's no open meeting law violation. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions from the board? Okay, so if not.
I don't know if it's
Whoop.
not so much a question. And maybe this goes back to next steps as opposed to, I just found it hard when I read this report and then I was working on our own report for the financial subcommittee, that important buckets were, and you addressed this in the last paragraph in here, that important buckets were being left out. And I just want to say, to the other board members, as we think about developing our own personal statements, some of those things that have not been fully reported on, to me, are absolutely critical. The community impact, for example, I do think has impact on our ability to maintain our educational programming. There are, there's a lot of work that goes into extracurriculars and supports and all of this from parents and from the community, and there's a lot that the community offers each of these schools and that these schools offer to their specific communities. And I don't necessarily just mean their geographic communities, but the people who are attached to these schools, parents, students, others who are assisting in these schools, form communities. And these are 3 small communities that are very important to the people that are in them right now. And I just think that somewhere in our analysis, each of us needs to think about that. And then the last one is sort of more, it's not directly related to that point, so it's kind of a little bit tangential. But I think one thing that gets lost when we talk about 21st century learning and we talk about STEM learning and all of that is that a lot of the reading that I've done on education, and again, I'm not an expert, I'm not a teacher, is that the businesses that are evolving, the thing they're looking for most in employees is emotional intelligence. And that is really formed at these earlier years and these elementary school years. And that emotional intelligence leads to adaptability. It leads to ability to want to go take on new skills or to work with people who are not like you. And I think that is one of the most critical things that we need to be focused on in our schools, along with the basics of reading and math that sort of form the building blocks of the technological education that we provide later on. And those are just sort of some things that I think we're just sort of floating about and maybe didn't have as fine a point on in any of our reporting. And I just want to make sure first the community knows we're thinking about those things, but also just to encourage everyone to have a section in that about their statement, how they thought about that, because I'd be curious to know how everyone else is thinking about that as we move forward.
Thank you, Bridget. I think we should probably move to the financial reporting. Is that what we have? Yes, the Smith Financial Subcommittee report. And we will be projecting, I understand, on this one?
Yes, please.
Here's-
Thank you. I feel so. Thank you very much, sir. Okay, so as Patrick and Martin proceeded, I'm not going to read this entire report to you. There are a whole lot of numbers in here. You would definitely be asleep at this time of night if I started reading this whole thing, but I will touch on some of the highlights. I guess the first point is really why we even formed a financial subcommittee when we had a consultant, a very good consultant, working for us to do the work. Am I just pushing the wrong button? How do I advance this, Stuart?
I always either use the board or the mouse, so if you
Okay.
want, I could drive for you.
No, it's okay. It just doesn't seem to be moving forward anyway.
There you go.
There
You
we
got
go.
it.
Okay. So basically what the financial subcommittee did was review the financial model. So Stephanie did a very good report for us and came and gave us sort of a high-level presentation and gave one to the community. But we just wanted to make sure that we understood how the financial model was built and what assumptions went into it and how the model was structured and whether there were any questions or concerns about that. And then outside of the financial model, there were a few analyses that we felt were not part of the purview of White and Burke. So it wasn't that they didn't do this work even though we had asked them. It was just outside of their purview. They were focused pretty much just on real estate. Inputs for them came from the district in terms of demographics and operating cost savings and those kinds of things. So we wanted to understand the things that were outside of the purview of the model. So some of the analyses that we looked at were a little bit, not detailed, but we looked into how we're matching up versus the demographics that were projected. We really wanted to take a deeper look at capacity because that really wasn't considered at all in the White and Burke model. They basically assumed that each of the options had enough capacity for the students that we were projecting. Stewardship costs, there were a lot of questions from community members as we got feedback from the different meetings we had and over email. And the intuitive question from a lot of people was, surely we have these 5 aging buildings. At some point, it's got to be cheaper to build one big new building and get rid of a lot of the stewardship on these 3 aging elementary schools. So we wanted to take a deeper look at stewardship costs. We also wanted to understand the operating cost savings that were in the projections because when we first had a look at them, they didn't quite make intuitive sense, so we wanted to dig a little bit deeper. We wanted to understand more about upgrade costs, and then tonight we'll also just sort of talk about some discussion points and some next steps on the financial analysis. So this is just Stephanie and White and Burke's high-level numbers again. So this is the whole district. So scenario 1, just to remind everyone, the price tag that they sort of came up with was $23 million. And that was basically for stewardship across the whole district. Scenario 2 was $58 million for stewardship for all 5 buildings, plus upgrades, not 21st century upgrades to be clear, but upgrades to things like things that NEASC had asked for. So additional gym space for the middle school, some upgrades to some lab spaces, but not major 21st century learning changes. Scenario 3 was to close Chamberlain School and make upgrades to all the remaining schools, the remaining 4 schools. That's why it's somewhat similar to scenario 2 because stewardship goes down, obviously, if you close one school, but then there are upgrades to the others that are remaining. Scenario 4, again, was $85 million, which included the cost of building a new school, a new elementary school, a smaller new elementary school. And scenario 5 was to consolidate everything into one school at a price tag of $89 million. And then we wanted to look more carefully at just the elementary only. One thing that we've really focused on is the elementary side because that's where the big decision about closing or not closing a school or schools has to come first. We think the middle school and the high school obviously are of a big concern, but we wanted to take a deeper look and take those out of the picture so we could understand better what the numbers are based on what our elementary school decisions are going to be. The one confusing thing that I found about this slide is that it still includes the stewardship and things for the middle school and high school, the one that Stephanie had provided. So a little bit of the analysis I'll get into in a minute just looks directly at the stewardship just for the elementary schools. So we can have a look at that. And then Stephanie had also given us elementary only tax projections for both a condo and for a house. So I won't go through these. They're in the packet that was printed out. Again, these numbers are based on the one on that previous slide, so it does include stewardship for the whole district, but it only includes major configuration changes to the elementary schools. So, as I said at the outset, we reviewed the financial model. We found the structure was pretty sound. There were no major, big mistakes or anything in it. One thing that we found a little bit challenging is that it was not built as a bottoms-up analysis that kind of said, here where the demographics are, that means this many students, that means this much in costs. So there was no real way to sort of use sensitivities on the demographic projections to determine how that might affect our costs and how that might affect our decision-making. So it really just focused on how much we thought we could get for each piece of real estate, and what the impact would be of each of the different choices we made about capital investment. And so as I noted at the outset, we still had questions on demographics, capacity, sensitivities, operating cost savings, stewardship costs, and upgrade costs. The demographics are already outdated. So I did want to just put up a slide that said where we were in comparison to the demographics that were done for the task force. So this number, interestingly, was also updated in the last, not this one we got tonight, but the one we got last time. This number for 2016 was updated to 944. This number, 934, became 944. So in fact, we were only 0.4% below the actual projections that the demographers made for us for 2016. Now this number we talked about a little bit at the outset tonight. This number is now at 984 versus 939. And the demographers projected we'd have 949. Yep, and there I did it. I touched it. And you warned me, Stuart. You did. You warned me. That it would change. So now we are actually at 3.6% above where the demographers came out, which is sort of a different picture than being below or spot on. And this one I just wanted to put up for reference, and it's in your packet for reference. This is what enrollment has looked like in the district since 1975. And these are the different colors, the different bands are the different schools. So you can see kind of where we are today. We're definitely not at the low point. We're definitely sort of on a general, slightly declining path versus, you know, our sort of high in 1999. But we're certainly not as low as we've been. Nor as high as we've been. So that just sort of puts things in a little bit of context. And I guess the demographics I thought were really important to talk about as we talked about capacity. So if we had a lot of excess capacity, or if we were right at capacity, the question is how firmly are we adhering to the demographics that were projected for us, and what risk are we taking if we close a school or we consolidate in some way. So there were sort of three ways that I could come up with anyway of looking at capacity. One was done for us previously. I didn't put up any slides about it because there really weren't slides done for us, but there were there were capacity analysis projections done on a square footage per student basis in 2008, and again with the task force. And those, I think, are the projections that were used by Stephanie to sort of say, as a band on either side, to say we should have enough capacity for all the students that we're projecting. The concern about that is that students don't sort of enroll evenly across the schools. They don't enroll evenly across the grades. There's a lot of lumpiness in that. So another way of looking at capacity is to say, here's where we would be in terms of the number of classrooms we would have in each scenario, and where would we need to get to in terms of average class size in order for that to be enough capacity in any of those instances. And so that's what this analysis shows. So this would be our capacity if we kept all three schools. And this is our projected need for the K through 5 elementary schools, so about 932 students by 2020. And so, as you can see, we'd have more capacity if we kept 3 schools open than we would need. Right now, this is sort of where we are. We're at about 17.5, 17.7, depending on the day of where our projections are. And so we would be slightly above capacity from the outset if we were to move forward with 3 schools. And then projected for 2020, we had a need for kindergarten through 4th grade of 773. Now, if we had Central and Orchard, that's this pink line. And so you would need to get to about just a little below 19 students per classroom in order to have enough capacity in those 2 schools to meet the needs of the students that we were expecting to have in K through 4. And we go down to K through 4 instead of K through 5 because in those scenarios where we would have 2 schools, we would be sending the 5th graders to the middle school. And then if we went with Central and Chamberlain, that would be this blue line, and Orchard and Chamberlain they're right on top of each other, so you can't see the 2 separate lines because Central and Orchard both have about the same capacity, which is about 20 classrooms right now, and Chamberlain has about 16 rooms that can be used as classrooms, not all of which are entirely being used at the moment. So a third way of looking at the analysis, and I'll post online the spreadsheet that I used as a backup to these graphs. I didn't want to get into the fine points of each of these analyses, just so that you would stay awake. But what I did was I took the demographer's projections and just took them as a given, and I said, you know, what would our need for classrooms be if each of these grades looked exactly like the demographer said, and each of the schools looked exactly like the demographer said. And then sort of looked at how much capacity we would have in each of the options, and then tried to compare what our capacity for students would be, the number of classrooms we would need versus what our actual number of classrooms available would be. So in scenarios 1 and 2, we would have 56 classrooms roughly. So when I say roughly, the reason there's this roughly around the edges is that there is a tiny bit of space outside of classroom space that could potentially be converted to classroom space in some of the schools. Orchard, for example, doesn't really have that space. So my understanding is there are 23 rooms at Orchard that are called classrooms, but 3 of those are being used for things that you can't really stop doing. So coaching and occupational therapy and some other things that you just can't change them into classrooms. So the net is 20 for Orchard. For Central, likewise, about 20 classrooms, and for Chamberlain, 16. So that's where we get to the 56. In options 1 and 2, this is kind of the line of how many classrooms we would need. So you can see there's just a little bit of bandwidth between there. So at the peak, in the early years, before our demographics start to decline a little bit, we would need maybe 54 classrooms in these early years, and it starts to decline until we get to, an excess capacity across the whole system of about 8 classrooms by about 2025. And then I did that for each of the different scenarios. So option 3, again, this is K through 4, because option 3 would send the 5th graders to the middle school. So we would be down to about 40 classrooms because we would just have Orchard and Central, and we would be right at capacity, and even we would need a little bit more than the capacity. And the reason this chart goes back a few years is that I wanted to just look at what it would have been if we had already had these different options in place, given the students that we had historically, just so we could kind of see some kind of trend. And so if we were really following the policy limits, the hard upper policy limits in these historical years, we would have been a little over capacity in terms of the number of classrooms we needed. And we sort of are right at capacity up until about 2024 in this analysis if we close Chamberlain. And then we have just a tiny, tiny little bit of bandwidth in the later years of the projections of about 2 classrooms if we went with option 3. Option 4 is just slightly more complicated because really you're talking about 2 different capacity issues. So you have your K through 2 students in one school and your 3 through 5 students in another school. So you really kind of have to estimate capacity at each of those schools as well as how much capacity you're going to need at each of those 2 schools. So this chart is just slightly confusing. So the gray line, and I should have used different colors in retrospect, it's kind of hard to see, I'm sure. The gray line, this upper line, is K through 2 capacity that we need, so how many classrooms we need. So we start off needing about 24 classrooms. For K through 2, we're talking about using Orchard, which has 20 classrooms in it. So at the outset, really the difference that you're looking at is between this gray line and this dotted blue line down here. We're short of about 4 classrooms at the outset for K through 2. For 3 through 5, I made the assumption that we were building the new school to have about 24 classrooms to try to make sure that we had enough capacity. There was nowhere where it was laid out by classroom how much space we thought we were building in either the smaller new school in this scenario or the bigger new school. It was more done in terms of number of students we thought we could hold. So this darker blue line would be the capacity that we would need for grades 3 through 5. And this dotted blue line up here is the capacity that we would have with 24 classrooms. So you can see there's a little bit of bandwidth between what we would need and what we would actually have. In option 4, for the 3rd through 5th graders, somehow we would need to make modifications to Orchard if we were really expecting to house the K through 2 kids there. And then option 5, I assumed that we built the new school to essentially have the same capacity as Orchard and Central together. And the reason we need fewer classrooms is, again, that smoothing out of enrollment. We can be more efficient in terms of how we allocate students across classrooms because they're all in one building. So this is our line for how many classrooms we would need. This is the line at 40 of how many classrooms we would have. So we would be a little bit tight up until about 2022, and then there would be a little bit of excess capacity to the tune of about 5 classrooms. So a couple of things to keep in mind when you look at that analysis. One, this sort of says the demographer's projections are exactly right. I didn't run a whole bunch of sensitivities around what happens if we're 1% above or 1% below. This was enough detail to sort of try to process. The second thing to keep in mind is that I use the hard limits that are in our policies as actual hard limits on a classroom by classroom basis. Now that's different, as Martin said at the outset, than how we often think about this as a district. So often we say that as a district we need to have an average number of an average number of students per class in first grade of under 20. This is harsher than that. That puts tighter bands on that by saying that each classroom is not going to have more than 20 if you're a kindergarten through third grade classroom, and it's not going to have more than 25 if you're a fourth through fifth grade classroom. So it's, to a certain extent, based on how we have been managing classroom sizes, is slightly overestimating the capacity that we will need because it's being very harsh on those limits on a classroom by classroom basis. There's a tiny bit of wiggle room. My concern as I did this analysis was that in pretty much all of the consolidation options, at least through the first 7 to 10 years, say we are very tight on capacity, and in some cases we're going to be over capacity, I think, in some of those scenarios. If the projections, even if the projections which show a decline are true, we're going to be right up against capacity. And that's part of the reason I asked these questions about 21st century learning, because as Erin was saying, if you have an extra classroom here, an extra classroom there, you can use those as project spaces in lieu of necessarily building a new space or something like that. If you're completely at capacity in the schools that you have, there are no opportunities for those kinds of learning experiences. And you also just end up in a situation where you might end up having to add on capacity to schools that are already there, which sort of defeats the purpose of closing down a school to avoid the costs associated with that school. So those are some things to think about in terms of capacity. There's a whole lot more detail, and I will ask if they can also post the Excel spreadsheet for the people who are really interested in actually seeing the hard numbers that back up those charts, because there's a lot more detail in it than that. Just moving along, the next section that we wanted to talk about really were stewardship costs. So again, we kept getting this question about won't the stewardship costs eventually outrun the cost of building a new school? And so these costs are, Stephanie and Whitenberg's model went out 20 years, and the assumptions in them for stewardship costs were provided by the district over 20 years. So this basically sums up what those projected stewardship costs just for the elementary schools would be over the course of those 20 years. So in option one, keeping all three schools open for the three schools, the district projected about $10.9 million. It was slightly lower at $10.4 million in option two, because you're assuming you're making some upgrades, and so those upgrades might negate the need for some stewardship that you were already planning. Option three, you go down to $8.0 million because you're closing one of the schools and also making upgrades to others. Option four down to 6.7, and option five down to 5.1. So you're still going to have some stewardship, even with a brand new building. There's still going to be upgrade and maintenance things over the course of 20 years, so you have to take that into account. So this line just sort of says how much we're saving in stewardship versus option one. So it's just a mathematical, subtract this number from that number. So you can see those cost savings, about $500,000 in option two, 2.8, 4.1, 5.7. And then when you factor those different things in, you can't just look at the stewardship savings. You have to also understand that there are going to be some costs for reconfiguration, particularly in the scenarios where we're moving students to the middle school out of the elementary schools. There's going to have to be some work done at the middle school to make way for those students. Even in option four, where we're keeping the fifth graders, Stephanie wanted to point out that there was some work that would need to be done at Orchard to accommodate all the K through 2 kids that would be coming in. So that's what these cost savings are versus option one. And then the capital costs for the new schools, so about $28.0 million, and about $37 million in options 4 and 5, because you're assuming you're building a bigger school in option 5. So what ends up happening is the net savings or additional spending that you get out of each scenario. Option one is obviously zero. About $500,000 in savings for option two, about $270,000 for option three, And then you're still about $26.4 million behind for option 4 and $33 million for option 5. And then we also wanted to add in operating cost savings as another element, just to see, because we obviously save some operating costs if we're becoming more efficient and consolidating down into fewer schools, and we're smoothing out this issue of the grades and suboptimal grade sizes in certain schools. And that gets us to these numbers here. I won't take you all the way through them, but basically it shows that option 2, you save about $500,000 versus option 1 still, because you're really not getting any operating cost savings. And you save almost $9 million over the course of 20 years in option 3. And then the others are still more expensive than options 1 or 2. And then finally, we wanted to add in the upgrades just to the elementary schools, when we talked about options 2, 3, and 4. Obviously, no upgrades in option 5 for the elementary schools because it's a brand new school, and so we'll build it the way we want it. So that was about $5.2 million we were estimating under option 2, 6.3 for option 3, and 4.9 for option 4. So the bottom line number, once you add all those different factors in, is that option 2 would be about $4.8 million more expensive than option 1. Option 3 would save you about $2.6 million, and option 4 would be $14 million more expensive than option 1, and option 5 would be about $22 million more expensive than option 1. I had a thought, I just lost it. Hold on, let me just see if I have it in my notes. Oh, upgrades. Upgrades. One of the questions I kept asking and the community kept asking as we went through this process was, can we please see a list of upgrades and how much each of these upgrades is supposed to cost, even if it's just a ballpark figure. And that information just simply has not been created. Not that I can find anyway, unless it's buried somewhere. I've asked every way I know, every person I know that I could ask where that list might be. My understanding is that there was a list of the types of things that would need to be done at each school given to Dorr and Whittier, who are the architects, and they came up with a ballpark number on a square footage basis that said, on a square footage basis, it'll cost, I have the number in my head, X number of dollars per square foot to upgrade this school, ignoring 21st century learning. And so there just simply isn't a list anywhere that I could find that shows us exactly what we're expecting to spend at each of the elementary schools. This is a very round figure based on square footage. Sort of the conclusions that came out of all these different analyses, for me anyway, and for the subcommittee as we talked about them, was that White and Burke did some very sound work, and they worked very closely with the district business office. The district business office was very responsive to them, and to me as I was working on these analyses with Elizabeth and Dan Fleming, who helped us. The demographics are tracking projections. It's still unclear where we're going to come out versus those demographic projections. And a lot of people in the community have pointed out there's a lot of new development. It appears that this year we're starting to see people from some of these new developments. It's too early yet to say what the exact impact of that is going to be, but we do need to be prepared, I think, if we're going to be slightly above those demographic projections. I don't think we can necessarily cut off a whole lot of capacity before we see how those projections play out. The costs of options 4 and 5 are simply not offset by reductions in operating costs and reductions in stewardship. So we as a community need to decide how much value we place on the potential educational benefits and the other benefits of options 4 and 5, and whether they're worth the price tag that we associate with them. If they are, that's great, but we need to understand that there is a price tag to options 4 and 5. They are not net zero versus some of the other options. And the upgrades really do need further work, but they're not a binary decision, meaning upgrades are one of those things where you don't have to commit fully to option 2 or fully to option 1. There can be some middle ground after we do some further study of what the high priority upgrades are. And as we sort of went through this, this last bullet about needing additional work for the vision of learning for the pre-K, for each of the different schools, is that I feel a little bit, as I went through this, like we were trying to understand exactly what space we would need before we knew exactly what we wanted the curriculum to look like. And really, I felt like we should be driving it the opposite way, which is sort of, especially for the pre-K to the elementary school, I should have put in there instead of pre-K. The elementary school, but I guess the pre-K, the middle school, and the high school have been less looked at, I would say, than the elementary school as we've gone through these analyses in preparation for making this decision. So they do need some more work. And so as we go forward, we really do, as a board, need to talk about where enrollment is and what are some guardrails. You know, if we really do start to see a decline, how much decline starts to create action for us or starts to ring alarm bells, and therefore, you know, what sensitivities could we run on some of these numbers to see if we're comfortable with each of the scenarios. Redistricting is another thing that we'll have to talk about in the future as a potential way of solving some of these issues if we choose not to go with some of the consolidation options. And then we need to talk about other options to address challenges like noise and equity and enrollment fluctuations. And then we still don't know about city center development in the UVM arena, where they're going next. And I think there's a bigger discussion, which we started tonight really, about the obstacles and opportunities for 21st century learning. So that's it for the formal presentation. So I'm happy to take questions. I should say one thing I didn't get into that's in the packet a lot is we did look at how many classrooms could be saved, quote unquote. So how many fewer classrooms we would need if we had enrollment in fewer schools, because we could, as I said, balance out better how many students were in each class, and we could optimize that without having to have some classes that have 14 students in them and some classes that have 21 students in them at the younger years. And that whole analysis I won't go through at this point, just given time. But I would be happy to open it up to questions from the board.
Yeah, does the board have questions? One of the questions I have, Bridget, is, one, thank you very much. That was really excellent data and analysis. The analysis on capacity, was there any factor, and again, I hate to open this kind of vagary about 21st century learning up again, but was there any factor that changed the amount of square footage needed per student because of a different environment compared to the one that we have today? Was that factored in at all?
No, it
Not that
wasn't.
we would have had the right way to do that, but it.
No, and because I really wasn't, as the older analysis that we had already seen, and the numbers are in here in terms of what capacities are, I didn't really focus as much on the square footage per student type analysis. I was more concerned with what classrooms we have and what classrooms we would have in the future without having to make significant changes before we start to incur a whole lot of extra cost. And the classroom spaces numbers really came from the 2008 report that Frank Locker did for us. He did a pretty detailed capacity study, had pictures in it, and showed, you know, all the different spaces. And then Annette Harton and Dan and I kind of worked on making sure that we were comfortable with those numbers, but we didn't really get into square footage, and we certainly didn't sort of factor in 21st century learning to that. It's still the sort of vague notion in my mind that if we had a little extra capacity, then potentially we could get some of those 21st century benefits by using those extra classrooms in a given school for those types of activities without having to completely build a new atrium or building a new flexible learning space.
Thanks. The other question that I had was related to what happens, what can we kind of project from the model after 20 years, if anything? Obviously, you know, within the 20-year span, option 4 and 5 are in the red, but they have, in some ways, savings that are larger than the others. They're just not paying them. What happens after? What can we assume happens after 20 years without digging too deep into doing a whole other analysis?
It's really tricky because, in truth, the demographers really only gave us good projections, like really detailed, thoughtful projections out through 2025. And everything after that in the model is really sort of just taking this the slope of the line, if you will, and sort of extrapolating that out. So we're sort of looking back over the previous 10 years and saying what was the average decline over the last 10 years and just extrapolating that out. So to get further out from that, it's hard to say. It's really hard to say because you're already in those last 10 years of the projections. It's already hard to say whether that's a fair assumption to make that we keep declining, or will we at some point reach a steady state where we're just
But if we
holding
made the
steady?
assumption that we kept a steady state with enrollment, not that I would necessarily suggest that we do that, but the financials after 20 years, when would those, I mean, could we make an easy assumption about when those lines would cross and option 4 and 5 would no longer be in the red? Because I'm assuming at some point that payback escalates in the out years. And I was trying to figure out is there a way to acknowledge that in our analysis?
It's not extremely easy. It could be done. It would mean extrapolating out the financial model another 10 or 20 years.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, that can certainly be done. But
Okay.
it's not an easy back of the envelope analysis to do because you're getting into bond repayment schedules and all of that stuff that would have to be put out another, basically, I think most of the debt in the model is incurred by year 11 or 12, I want to say, and it's 30-year debt. So you're talking about then extrapolating the model out from a 20-year model to more like 41 or 42. And I would assume somewhere in there you would get to the point where there would be some comparison between the stewardship and the cost of those new schools. The challenge that you also get into, though, is that as the new schools become less new schools, there's also more stewardship for them
agreed.
as well. So that starts to pick up as well. Yeah, I mean, there's certainly an analysis that could be done, and we could probably do it ourselves without incurring a lot of extra white and brick cost. It would just take some time.
I do
So-
think the quality, though, of the forecast enrollment obviously goes down the further out you are, too.
Sure.
I think that one thing I think the stewardship tried to take into account is the run rate of some of the things we know the history has been around, for instance, materials mitigation. I mean, over the years, I've been on the board over 10 years, and between asbestos and PCBs and I'm trying to think what other materials have come up that every time you start some kind of work on the building, there's a significant portion of the improvement that's associated with mitigation activity. So it's sort of what we don't know from a future standpoint with older facilities. And then on top of that, there are federal and potentially state guidelines that we couldn't have anticipated years ago with ADA compliance and items like that, again, I think what we know is built into the stewardship plan, but we didn't know those things 10 or 15 years ago either. So it's an element of what don't we know for the last 10 years of a new model.
You are with your
Yeah.
assumptions, sure. Other questions from the board at this point? Questions from the community? Yes, sir.
An interesting point. You've got 5 buildings here, and certainly you have made an analysis of where the PCBs are in the 5 buildings. That's not hard to do. And an analysis of where the asbestos is, if any still left, in the 5 buildings. Have you done that kind of work, that analysis work?
Well, the answer is kind of yes and no. I mean, we know of like product, like in our tile, we know there's a slight percentage of asbestos, so we typically have planned when we've done renovations in certain areas, we know we kind of plan on that. What we haven't planned on, for instance, the windows, when we began that process, we had to do the appropriate testing. We didn't realize that there was a slight trace of PCBs in the window glazing, right? And so there's likely other things like that. I can't quite think of other, components of our buildings in that same vein, but there are, to Elizabeth's point, there's some of those things that are unknown. We think we've uncovered a good number of them because we've been doing a pretty good job of looking at them, but there's always that sense of unknown in older buildings. The elevator project is a good example as of recent, when we had to expand that shaft to make it ADA compliant. It was a big surprise when we found out that electricity was running, the main electricity was running right underneath that. And so we obviously were like, wow, now we've got to stop things up. We had to rethink. So it's always some of those surprises. And again, we're going to have to address that electricity and route it appropriately around the building. But those are some of the things that are, part of the unknowns of a facility that we weren't, we didn't construct. It was done some years ago.
And we're okay, David, with ADA requirements as long as we're not touching or changing something, but then once we decide to make a change, we have to make it.
Right, I'm
According
not
to-
your ADA expert, but
Right.
basically, there's a couple categories. There's doing the right thing.
Right.
To allow our community and our children,
Right.
based on our ADA, to comply. And then there's also, if we significantly, construct, change our facilities, it begins to trump the requirement that we have to start to address and meet the expectations of ADA compliance. So there's kind of that very fine balance. Most of what we've been doing, as a school district, has been paying attention to those, where we have been putting, access doors that allow for easier entrance for our individuals that are handicapped or in additional need, the elevators, flooring, et cetera, bathrooms. We've been paying attention to that, but certainly, there's some of those other areas that we would need to pay attention to.
And correct me if I'm wrong, the committee had asked that question of John Stewart as well with regard to ADA compliance, especially when we pushed back a little bit on the stewardship projections because we thought they seemed a little bit low. And we said, what are we missing potentially? Are there any big events that we should sort of say, well, there's only a 20% chance of it happening, but we should have some kind of expected value in here for, there's a 20% chance of this $2 million thing that might come down the pike. And he was fairly comfortable. I mean, and maybe you have a different view, but John Stewart had said to me, the elementary schools, especially when we were just talking about the elementary schools, are technically ADA compliant. And it's easier for them to be ADA compliant because they're one-story buildings, and there's already been a lot of, work done to make them ADA compliant. He didn't have a sense that there was any major, at least not with ADA, any major thing out there on the potential horizon unless a law changed and, some new thing was added.
Well, I think we did hear some minor things. I think doorways.
Doorways, but I thought
from an
he had
access
some-
standpoint, but
We've definitely,
yeah.
we did pay some dollars to get an ADA study, and that was part of then put in place into our stewardship plan. And I think some of the other areas, though, are looking at, the unknowns, and I would say some of the intricate workings of our facility, where there's, again, and we've done a good job, I think, to look into those, but where air handlers, devices, and ductwork is there, there's always some sense of, when we get into that, we assume the construction was of a certain quality, and I get into the ductwork and things of that nature when, there's some unknowns. Again, we didn't construct it, and we can't necessarily see it. We assume that it's the right size and provides the right kind of thing. So, those are some of the examples. I think we're very fortunate, though, that we've done a pretty decent job to identify and to study our facilities for the, far better than most, probably.
And John pointed out as well, he made clear at every meeting that part of the reason we're not seeing bigger stewardship projections out into the future is that we've been a district that's been very good about keeping up with it. So we've replaced roofs well before they've fallen apart. There aren't major things that we've not been attending to that are delayed maintenance that could pop up later.
Right. Good point.
Yes, ma'am.
First of all, that was an extraordinary analysis, thank you. It was really well done and very helpful.
Well, thank you.
I'm a little bothered by several things that you raised, starting with the fact that we don't have a list of what the upgrades are. You're asking us to spend a lot of money somewhere along the way for something we can't identify. But I'm probably more disturbed by the fact that the demographers made a mistake in the first year projections. And if they made a 5% mistake in the first year, and I looked just briefly at the DRB agenda for tonight, and there are requests to build the numbers ranged from somewhere between 100 and 350 new homes. How many more children is that going to bring in that the demographers may not have allowed for in their calculations? And so if some of these proposals have us already at capacity, I don't want to think about that. A kindergarten and first grade teacher who's already at the cap right now and is going to have to go up. The enrollment numbers, there were a few of them that would be of concern, and they would potentially go up above that. So thank you, but it leaves a lot of questions, I think, in terms of whether or not we really ought to proceed in one direction versus another.
We use 20 as the capacity number. What do Shelburne, Essex, Colchester use?
You want to respond to that one? Do you have the capacity numbers for other schools?
No, I don't.
Oh, and
know
I
what
just
they
want to,
do.
I just want to be clear, it's not 20 students per classroom. I'm saying that there are 20 classrooms per school. And that,
Actually, there's 20, in your list, you had 20 students you want in the classroom.
I
they're-
understood that,
Yeah.
but I was also concerned about the class size piece.
Right.
In terms of if you have this many classrooms and you're at capacity, that means you have to increase class size.
yes.
If your school doesn't have any room to grow.
I think for your question, ma'am, I don't think we have handy the number of students per classroom for other communities right,
And they're just
right
curious,
handy
if
with
it's-
us. It's a
if-
fair
if
question.
Shelburne is 25,
No,
what do we,
Right.
Yeah.
Why are we a different from
Yes.
somebody else? Yeah, I think we can get that, but we don't have that with us tonight.
I think, though, just to add a little bit to that, what Bridget had said was she used a hard limit from our policy, which actually is a pretty conservative, I mean, we're still compliant with the district's current policy, but our practice has actually been that it's typically been less than that, so the band is a little bit wider than that, but I think the analysis was intended to sort of say, within current policy limitations, where would we start narrowing that band and sort of start to raise a potential red flag?
Thank you. Abby?
I want to echo what some of the other comments were, just that was fabulous and really informative and eye-opening as well to see some of the information we've had presented in a clear way, helped really put some pieces together. And likewise, the thing that jumped out for me right away was the fact that we're 35 students over this year's projection, and the demographer's report said we were in a total of 20 years up and a decline by 100 students for the district. So in 1 year, we're at like 33% of that off. Makes me question that stability of the decline looking ahead. And I just want to make sure I'm reading this correctly. When you look at how you took, and I know what you said was, we have to go with what we have, and so you said I took the demographer's report as fact. So we already know that we all agree that there's a red flag there based on what happened this year. And then if you look at option 3, the slide on page 11, when you look at your capacity analysis, if you trust the demographer's report, you're pushing capacity, which raises red flags because I'm not sure if there's many people who trust the demographer's report. But then when you look at slide 15, when you're talking about operating cost savings, I question potential savings with option 3 at all. It lists a potential savings of maybe almost $9 million, but if in theory we did close one school and move to K4, based on the demographer's report alone, we'd have to modify those schools pretty quickly, and therefore might slam that potential $9 million savings right away. And so I just want to comment on that, because when you look at slide 15, it looks like, oh, hey, option 3 might be okay. We're saving some money, but those red flags jumped right out because we're at capacity using numbers that we're already way off on. So it's just a concern.
Thank you. Yes, over here.
When we're talking about class size at elementary, I'm pretty confident that the ideal size between 17 and 20, over 20 is pretty problematic at elementary level.
I just wanted, sorry, I forgot to mention something. And I want to say that I appreciate how you said the max at 20 for K through 3, and it's 25 for 4 and 5, because when we average it out, it looks like we're actually in control, but we're not, because 3 out of our 4 classrooms at one of the schools are already over the max of 20. But if you take an average, that low of 16 brings that number right down, and it looks like we're in control. So as a parent who has kids in the actual classrooms, I'd rather see what proportion of our classrooms are actually within the limits rather than an average over the entire thing. It's way more useful, I think.
You have a question over here? Or-
Yeah, I think my concern is also not just the capacity, but the square footage. And what square footage were you looking at? Like, I'm assuming 21st century will have a larger square footage for a classroom?
Yeah, and as I mentioned to Patrick, I did not look at square footage of the classrooms. I left that to previous analyses because I was more concerned about making sure that we had enough classrooms. And I was also making a very broad assumption that our policies for how many students we were allowing in each of our classrooms had somewhat in the previous years been set based on what we knew our classrooms looked like. So those were some big assumptions that went into that, admittedly. And there has been recently raised to us, interestingly, a concern that the classrooms at Chamberlain are smaller than ideal, and that trying to push 20 students into some of the lower grades, or 25 students especially in some of the upper grades, if we ever got to a situation where that were to happen, would be somewhat problematic.
And from experience, my daughter was in 4th grade at Orchard last year, and this year they're going to be like 5 more students. And I've been in those classrooms multiple times last year with her, and I can't envision how you're going to fit 5 more students in that classroom at its current size. So I can't imagine that same square footage being used and keeping it at capacity. So I guess that's one of the concerns that I would have is what square footage you're looking at too.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions from the community? Yes, ma'am.
I have a basic question that I think the board should address before this is brought to the public. I feel that the term 21st century learning should be defined. This is used as a catch-all and a panacea and a dream, a nirvana. It doesn't come to me as something specific, achievable, concrete, or realizable in our lifetime. So I'm interested in how the children will be more engaged by this ephemeral thinking that is going on.
Thank you, ma'am. Art.
A couple of historical points, just to put some things in context, and then I have a couple of questions. It's great to see all this information come to light. On page 8, the graph that you presented is extremely interesting in that the tipping point that happens in 98, 99 is when Act 250 redefined some of the hurdles and requirements that made it harder to build in Vermont. The course of development has decreased. As the course of development has decreased, population has gone down. Interestingly enough, today, I think it's Business People Vermont, their August issue, presented a great demographic analysis on 2014 compared to 2015 Vermont demographics. And in Chittenden County in 2014, there were roughly 160,000 people. It went up 800 people in the last year, so there's almost 161 or somewhere around 161,000 in Chittenden County. Total Vermont population went from 626,600 down to 626,000. So overall, the state lost 600 people, even though Chittenden County gained 800. So there's some cannibalizing that's happening from the other communities that people are starting to move into here. So we need to be careful about these demographic blips that we've seen and this idea that the first year isn't quite correct. One of the things that the demographer will tell us, or told us, was that demographics is based on 3 things. It's based on mortality rates, birth rates, and migration rates. It does not look at economic changes or things that happen in the economic climate that may drive these things. And you need to look out and take the long view. Historically, the demographer that was used, if you look 10 years out from when he gave his projections, are within 0.1%. That's other demographers that have been hired by those school districts where he worked to go and evaluate the work that he did, and he was within 0.1% after 10 years. So I understand that there's a big blip in the first year. I would just exercise some caution in terms of throwing the baby out with the bathwater on that particular piece. On the numbers, very interesting, and maybe just some cross-coordination here that needs to happen, Bridget, but it looks like the numbers that were carried through for the elementary model, they differ on each of the 3 pages. I'm not sure why that happened. And on sheet 4, the new school is $38 million. And then if we turn to another page, it's $37 million. And another page, it's $39 million. So I just ask as you go through this and kind of fine tune it, just make sure that the numbers work out in comparison to all 3 of those. And then lastly, I was curious as to why I think on one of these, in scenario 5, there's, on page 16, there's actually $2 million of cost for reconfiguration in option 5. And I'm curious why, if we're building something new, there's costs.
That's for the middle school. So you're moving the fifth graders to the middle school because the assumption is that we can't build a school big enough at the property that we've been talking about to house the fifth graders. So we have to reconfigure. That's what all those costs mostly
Okay,
are. The
great.
option 4, there are some costs at Orchard to reconfigure it to fit a slightly different pattern in terms of students, because we're talking about K to 2 students as opposed to just K to 5. And so that's why there are some costs in there, even though the fifth grade is staying with the elementary schools. But option 5, that's just middle school cost, because basically David would get kicked out of his office and they would have to completely reconfigure that hallway to make it a separate house for the new fifth graders.
Thank you. Perhaps maybe a slight adjustment to the title then that makes it easier to understand that there are middle school costs in there.
Okay.
Just off the bat.
Yep.
Thanks.
Great.
Debbie?
Sorry, one last question. One thing that I don't know if it's within the scope of this report or not, but when we're looking at option 5, and you mentioned that the property that you're thinking of for consolidation is that Oak Creek property, which is like roughly the size of one of our existing elementary properties. And if I picture in my head one of our existing elementary properties needing to hold actually all 3 physical schools, I figure, okay, well, you'll have to go up a couple stories for the classroom size. But what about the parking lots? Will they have to triple in size? And if you're actually not expanding in the acreage for one of our schools, I just don't know how that will physically fit outside of the building. So I think when we talk about if you build a consolidated school and these are the classrooms you'll need, what about the outside space? Will we have enough green space? Will we have enough parking space? And I, as part of the task force, seeing all of those options that were put forth to us then, I still don't see one that would work. And I'm very curious as to how we could triple our parking lot size, triple our green space size, and triple our building size, yet keep one footprint of one school. And I think the cost to the outside renovations would need to be included in that.
Okay.
Thank you. All right. Not seeing any more questions. I know we're a little bit behind schedule, which is not unusual for this board. But we do have the community feedback, and I think, Elizabeth, you're going to do that?
I'm going to do that.
All right.
And
Are you projecting as
Elizabeth,
well?
I do have a PowerPoint there that you sent. Are you
You know,
going
I
to use
think,
it?
does everybody have a copy of the community feedback handout? I think I may just do it from here, because I think a lot of this has been shared before, but I guess I'd preface my comments on the community feedback is what the board did and the way Patrick led this meeting is this was our effort to summarize a lot of complicated information from a variety of sources that the board has been in receipt of over many months. So what you have in front of you is really the 2 subcommittee reports, and then we made an effort to summarize the community feedback as well into some themes. So that's what I'm going to share with you, and the board's had a chance to look at it and discuss it a little bit in the past, but it will go into deliberations for whatever recommendations come forward. So this starts out with a summary of the feedback process. I don't think I need to go through this, but our initial presentation of the White and Burke feedback and securing feedback from the community was March of this year. And our commitment was to hold 3 additional community meetings prior to the summer break. And over the summer, the board spent some time deliberating much of that community feedback. If you move on to the next page, some of the objectives were to provide information to the community and kind of outreach as much as we could, look at some of the trade-offs that were embedded in each option in terms of both what the board was anticipating, but also to get feedback from the community as to what each of you felt trade-offs might be, and then to further detail costs and impacts on taxpayers. So our goal was to really look at some of the priorities and concerns we were hearing, as well as to ascertain whether there were preferred options that were coming forward at this point. The next page kind of highlights the participation, and I will say I feel like the board felt, in general, there was a high level of participation throughout the March meeting as well as the balance of the 3 meetings. We had about 220 folks in attendance, and we received about 145 feedback forms. I'd also highlight that as a percentage of total population within South Burlington or the total voting population, I think as a percentage of voters, that's at about, actually of voters, I think it's about 1.5% or so of the voting population. And which, I don't know if it's good or bad, it just is what it is, but that's the feedback. One of the questions that came up early and one of the board's desires was to really see feedback from a variety of stakeholders in the community. So the next page is really a breakdown of participants. About 68% of the folks we received feedback from represented parents and guardians. As you go through it, we had business owners, teachers, property owners. The average number of years in South Burlington was 18, average age was 50, and you can kind of see the breakdown by location within the city.
I just wanted to stop real quick on that chart. One of the main concerns we had was, were we getting enough feedback from the main catchment area for the Chamberlain School? We were a little bit concerned about not hearing enough from that neighborhood, and we feel like we had better participation than we expected from that neighborhood as we went through.
As you move on to the next, I think as you might recall, on the feedback forms, we had a rating of, was it 0 or 1 to 5?
It was 1 to 5.
Yeah. So this generates, of the 145 respondents, this was sort of the ratings that each of the options received. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, just to say that the board has reviewed this and will take it into consideration as we move forward. I think the themes will probably be the most relevant. In terms of the least and most favored options, again, this is the ranking for each of the 5 options, going from status quo to a fully consolidated model of what was least and what was most preferred by those folks that responded.
And since the colors didn't come through, the least favored is on the left, and the most favored is on the right. I should have done that in cross-hatching or something, so it was clear in a black and white copy. Again, this will be on the district website, so you can go look at all the pretty colors on the district website. But this basically just says that, for example, option 1, 22 people ranked that as their least favored option, and 17 people ranked it as their most favored. I also just did want to, there was a little bit of a discussion around the biggest meeting, the high school meeting, that the rankings were unclear. It was unclear to people whether it was supposed to be ranked 1 to 5 or 5 to 1. And so what we initially did was to go through and throw out any feedback form that we couldn't tell whether people understood what they were doing. So if most of the feedback forms we got back had some kind of comment that said, I'm really happy about consolidation, or I really don't want consolidation. And you could kind of tell based on that whether they ranked 1 to 5 or 5 to 1. And so for those, we just kind of adjusted them and left them in the analysis. For the ones we really couldn't tell, we did have to throw them out. So I should have been more clear that it wasn't all 145 respondents. It turned out to be a reasonably small number, though. It was somewhere on the order of 15 people that we really just could not figure out. And I kind of did in the spreadsheet that we can also post. I suppose we could post the spreadsheet as well that has all the raw information in it. I did it reversing those rankings or not reversing those rankings, just leaving them as we got them to kind of see if it would influence the end. Basically, the numbers look about the same. You get about the same number of people making a mistake one direction as the other. So it didn't turn out to make a huge difference.
So one of the challenges that Bridget and I took on were to really look at all the individual comments that were made, which I can't even count the number of comments that were summarized, but themes started to develop as we went through these comments. And between the two of us and what we provided to the rest of our colleagues were the items you see of themes on the next page. And one was discussion or comments on 5th grade at the middle school, really prioritizing the high school in terms of investments, and also the impact on students' readiness for their next step. Community impact, and that covered the range of everything from property values to having a neighborhood school, things like that. Student and family impact in terms of engagement, in terms of convenience. There was a host of issues that came up there. Cost-benefit analysis. There, in the process, changes to options came up. There were a couple of different recommendations for options that weren't fully evaluated with the financial model through White and Burke, so we documented those. And then the process itself, as well as leadership and capacity. So those were the themes that were developed. We also received emails through the school board suggestion box and directly, and then also feedback included public comments at board meetings. So I do think the board received a lot of feedback on this, and we'll include that in our deliberations. In terms of some of the general themes that came out, largely in the community meetings, but also through this feedback process, was a real desire to keep Chamberlain open as a priority despite noise concerns. There was an interest in looking at a further study of noise and possibilities for mitigation, which we've had conversation at recent past board meetings and will continue to have, and a need to address issues associated with declining enrollment as it relates to equity, class size, and so forth. The gamut of feedback relative to noise ranged from we accommodate the brief periods of noise that exist from the airport right now to, as we have new American families come into our school system, there are students that come to us that noise represents some kind of post-traumatic stress. So it's a whole range of options or feedback that we got. But from a neighborhood standpoint, there was a theme of keeping Chamberlain open. Concerns in options 3 and 5 about moving fifth graders to the middle school, and this was a dialogue that has occurred in front of the board before. There did represent some opportunities for expansion of middle school's offerings and then grouping and coming up with a looping 5th and 6th grade option. But again, some of the same concerns and opportunities that have come up with a 5th grade at the middle school came up through this feedback process as well. The high school is a priority for the community versus elementary schools, and we say versus here because there was feedback throughout the process of, as I alluded in my opening comments, that investments in the high school might better help students meet their next steps, whether it's a vocation, employment, or college education, and be competitive in a global environment rather than investments in the elementary school. And that was not really addressed in terms of the task force study itself that was commissioned through the City School Steering Committee, but it was identified in the reports as a unanimous interest of the task force. There were concerns voiced about property values and impact on communities if schools were consolidated. Concerns about the costs of building new facilities, and I think Bridget's done a nice job summarizing those in the financial analysis. And then concerns about impact on students and families if schools were to be consolidated. And there are a number of logistical issues that were not evaluated. For instance, transportation. We did get a lot of feedback of just sort of time on the road by students, for instance. So there are a number of logistical issues in terms of operationalizing a consolidated model, as well as, I would say, that exists within current facilities as well, where there may be additional airport noise with the noise envelope changing and the F-35s coming in, and then as well as the recently discussed improvements to Market Street, for instance, in terms of construction, noise, and access to the central school property. So in terms of next steps, our goal is to actually post the aggregated community comments on the website rather than really trying to interpret that raw data. I think our goal is to actually post. I think the board is in agreement that we were going to post the raw data there so people could look through it. We are going to post answers to selected frequently asked questions, and the reason we say that is some of the questions may become irrelevant based on the options and the recommendations the board makes around specific configuration options. Our goal was to get these reports out to the community to digest, so those will be posted. And then the final White and Burke report that Patrick alluded to and David indicates will be on the website soon. I'll go with that. We're looking for community reaction to this presentation this evening and this discussion. And then I think, Patrick, that segues into, unless you want to get some additional feedback into our board discussion.
Yeah, let's see if we have any community comments on this or any board comments on this. Actually, first, do we have any, I know we've seen this in different forms multiple times, but any questions from the board on this? From the community, any questions or comments on this?
I have one quick question. When Abigail asked about the site
Yes.
for the new school, in phase one of the Burke and White's presentation here, they were supposed to, and I'm sure they did, let's see, evaluation of new school site, that is the zoning, physical limitations such as wetlands, adequacy of size, etc., which I would also throw in subsoil investigation. So has that been done, and if so, is that gonna be on this thing you're gonna put on the website? Or have you ever seen this answer to this, because that was the answer to her question.
That's a fair question. I don't have an answer for you tonight, unless someone else remembers what was in that report that we can share.
Well, I know that that work was done. I know that the site was vetted. I know that the wetland study was done. I know that the property was vetted for capacity of parking and allowing for all of the right, the right sizing needed. Again, back in the 2008 report, it was looked upon as an opportunity as a site for a high school site. And there was a fair amount of discussion at that time that it did not have the capacity, or it was very close on the capacity for having to accommodate a high school. But again, that work was done, and that was communicated to White and Burke. And again, I'm not negating the need to maybe provide some more information to that, consistent with some of the questions that came up tonight.
Yeah.
We can provide.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
As to posting to the website and community feedback, is this the last community feedback session along with the board before it goes onto the website, and then it'll just be reaction to that raw data? I'm just curious as to the
Yeah, I think what our plan is right this minute at 9:21 is we're going to take the materials that we've created, we're going to get those to the website and post it as soon as feasible based on resources. And we're about to start a conversation with the board about what our next steps are and whether or not we will need more time, whether we want to get more community involvement, any of those things. So we're about to have that conversation, I think. Thank you. Anybody else? All right, thank you. All right, so we've done the educational opportunities, the financial subcommittee report, we've done their questions and the feedback, so it's time for some discussion on next steps. What is the board's pleasure on next steps? Do people feel like they have an opinion on where we go on September 7th with our next steps? Other thoughts?
I think that we should, on September 7th, allow the public to come and respond to the information we provided. I know we've talked about that date was a date we would all weigh in kind of where we are at this point, but I think to give a full opportunity to the community to have weighed in, folks who haven't been able to be here, folks who may look at the web and look at the information there, to, set aside an hour at the September 7th meeting for people to comment, and then take that under advisement and make some sort of decision on the second meeting, which would include, obviously, statements by each board member of where they stand and perhaps debate and perhaps a decision.
I think Martin's right that we gain a significant proportion of our population back after, that meeting, by that meeting time. So we may have more participation at that meeting.
I don't disagree in terms of the availability of the community to kind of come and participate and digest this information prior to that. I'm not sure that potentially kind of coming up with individual statements is in conflict with that, though, because I think we could potentially do both. And what I'm thinking about more so is our discussion at the last meeting, which I think, Martin, you weren't able to be at, but we were sort of backing into if we were to make a recommendation on a ballot item, whatever that might look like in November, we had to warn that at a certain date, which I think
I
required,
think it's September 24th.
yeah, so there would
That might
be.
be too tight, yeah.
Yeah, that's
okay.
pretty
Oh,
tight.
Yeah, if that's, yeah, I wasn't here to hear that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, yes, I think that we can be flexible and hear what the community is telling us between now and the 7th, and on the 7th as
Mhm.
well, and adjust where we are, and perhaps we're gonna be debating among ourselves. You know, it's not just reading a statement, it's potentially trying to convince each other of the rightness of our
I will
positions.
throw out, because I don't think any of you can actually physically reach me right now, we could schedule another meeting between now and.
Wait a minute, don't you throw-
Feedback and then still-
That's right.
I don't
You can throw things, I forgot, yeah, sorry.
I don't think that's a bad idea.
Yeah, that might be fine. I mean,
That seems to strike a little bit of a middle ground. It would be a warned meeting where our only purpose would be to hear feedback.
My only concern is whether there's enough time to actually warn people and get them here, because that would, I mean, I guess it's basically, how many weeks, how many days before the next
2
one?
weeks.
2 weeks? So we're talking, we're basically giving people a week's notice. I don't know if it's enough, or, I'm,
I mean, if we're looking at people being available and schedules, I'm thinking, I mean, convocation is Thursday, and the first official day of school for students is the 31st, for all students. So that's not a, if I just sort of think about the burden on families and communities and students in terms of a topic that they're probably pretty interested in, that's a pretty tight time frame.
Yeah, I think the only way, if we wanted to keep the 7th, the other option is to move the 7th out to the 14th and not wait till the 21st. And have a conversation on the 7th with the community and make our statements on the 14th. I mean, I appreciate the comments about making sure that we get the feedback, and I'm trying to find a way to balance that with with keeping this thing moving. We've been discussing this topic for quite some time.
I'm kind of with Elizabeth, that I don't think it's necessarily in conflict for us to go ahead and let the community know where each of us is headed, or where we are at that moment, and then still take feedback. And, you know, we're reasonable people. If we really get strong feedback, you know, we can take that into consideration before we have any kind of a vote or any kind of, you know, full decision. But I don't think it's necessarily bad to come on the 7th with statements that say, you know, here's my thinking and here's how I got to where I am. So,
And have some action item to move it forward that same evening?
the action item is a different issue. I
'Cause
don't
the
think
action
so.
item's the trigger for the 24th, so that we'd be
Right.
delaying the action till the 21st anyway in that model, so that, I'm not sure that helps us on the 24th date if we do it that way. That's my concern.
I see.
Well, I mean, in fairness, I wasn't necessarily anticipating action accompanying individual statements. And I'll just share kind of frankly, not so much where I'm at, but, you know, this has been a concentrated effort to work on and absorb a lot of information, first in the subcommittees, now as the whole board, and shared it with the community. You know, to say I would have a definitive, this is where I'm at, personally, would be unfair, but I would like the opportunity to kind of, as we've gone through this, I've been making notes to myself of sort of what I'm weighing in on, sort of what the overriding strategy seems to be emerging from my perspective, and I think all of you have, I'm sure you have different thoughts going on, so it's as much an opportunity to frame our individual thoughts as board members and have that deliberation as a group.
I think we need to take the ballot item off the table while we're trying to make this decision. I don't think the ballot item should drive the thought process that goes into it. I mean, I think we need to be able to have a healthy debate about the issues here without, I mean, there are many times we can put something on the ballot. I mean, there's a March election.
And that goes back to, I mean, we talked about this at the last meeting, which is that any ballot item that we would have ready by November would be a very high-level ballot item. There's
Right.
no way we would have the math done to know what kind of bond we
Bond
would
or, yeah.
need or any of that. So in any instance, it wouldn't necessarily be a trigger for the start of work on that process. The trigger for the start of work would have to necessarily be a later vote. So, yeah, I'm kind of with you there. I do feel this urgency, though, to sort of get our positions out there, because we have had the summer to sort of think through a lot of this. And I know that we're just formally presenting this to each other now, but we've all been doing a lot of thinking about it and a lot of thinking about the feedback that we've been getting. And, I am starting to feel like the community kind of deserves, not an answer, but just to sort of know where we're going and where we're headed. And that's why I kind of advocate for an earlier statement from each of us. Because frankly, we haven't really discussed it, because it's not executive committee material. I don't even know where each of you really come out on this issue, and it would be nice to sort of have that to inform our own thinking as we come to a final decision as well, because I still feel like I'm operating even a little bit in the dark in terms of other people's opinions, so.
And I think that's what I'm saying about the ballot item. We don't know where each other stands necessarily. I mean, I know we've had some one-off conversations, but.
Well, and it's, it's not even so much the positions, it's the deliberations,
Right.
the five of us talking this out.
Yeah.
And so,
I just wouldn't want to lose the flexibility of doing something on the November ballot if that's where we end up. Because if it's the difference between a week of, a ballot is a vote by the community. It's another survey in its grandest form. So, again, we already know it's not going to have the level of specificity of a bond, for instance, but it could be really meaningful feedback, and we know there's going to be a high level of participation in the November timeframe. So my sense of urgency is really on not losing that opportunity if we determine there's information vis-a-vis a ballot that we really want to get.
Can you give me an example of a kind of high-level ballot item that you would see on there?
No, because I don't know what's legally,
Okay.
what is legally appropriate. Yeah.
so can we plan on deliberating our positions out there, whatever, and having the input on the 7th, and have us keep the 14th available if we need to continue our deliberations
We do that.
that following week, and we'll make a judgment on the 7th?
So put a placeholder in for the 14th
Right,
as a potential meeting.
correct. If we need more time to deliberate as a board.
That makes sense to me.
I can work with that.
The other thing that brings to mind, and I think we talked about this last time a little bit, is that I think that board meeting on the 7th is scheduled for Chamberlain, is it not? And the
Yeah,
question is
I
whether we
haven't known
think
about
that's a
that.
big enough venue if
Right.
we're really expecting more community participation that night.
Do you think it is?
No, we can move it back. We can move it back here. This is where our common meeting, we do have tried to, and we've done a good job getting out to our different communities. Unless you think that will bring in some of the Chamberlain group, but I think this is a much more known location, where our regular meetings have happened. So I think this would be we can change it.
Change your article again.
Yeah, done. We'll change that right now.
Okay, so it's the pleasure of the board that we will come into the September 7th meeting with an opportunity to hear feedback from the community and offer where we currently are in our deliberations individually and have some debate on this topic, as well as whatever else we decide to put on it in a few minutes for other topics. And a placeholder for the 14th that we will hold to either continue that debate or potentially take action.
So can I just be clear, the deliberate, where we are in our deliberations personally, and are we expected to choose one of these options?
I think I would expect people to say anything from, I think option X is the one, or I can't make a choice because I still think we need this, this, and this before I think wherever you are is
Yeah, okay.
what I would expect. Is that fair? Do people feel comfortable with that? Okay. Any other comments from the community before we move on to the next agenda item, which is really exciting? Policy development. All right. We will move on to the next agenda item. Mr. Young,
Yep. So we're.
third reading.
Third reading, our wellness policy. We're happy to have Susie back. If you have specific questions, but I think we vetted these last time and made some corrections, and I don't think,
we had any
we made
edits
those.
last time that we asked for. Thanks for hanging around, Susie.
Thank you.
Very interesting.
Any comments or questions or on this?
I'm all for wellness.
Yeah, love the wellness.
All right. So this is warrant for action, so.
I move that we approve the,
Well, don't we go,
No.
we go
No.
through the sheet, right?
Not on this one.
Policy.
this is not monitor,
No,
this
this
is
is
policy.
different.
Oh, okay,
Update,
got it.
yeah.
I move that we approve the updated wellness policy F5, is that, am I supposed to say F5, is that?
You can.
I
Okay.
second
You
the
just did.
motion.
I just did.
And I have a second. Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? The motion passes.
Thanks, Susie.
Thank you, Susie, for all your hard work. Yes, thank you.
Great. All right, we've already eliminated evaluation of superintendent. We will come back to that on the 7th, and we now need to see what else on the agenda for the 7th.
So we just talked about moving that, to
Yeah, it's
the-
already number 11 on the 7th, so we're good there.
We're gonna move it to FHCMS for location.
Yep, we probably do not need city-school collaboration because we will not be meeting with
That's right.
Helen and Kevin between now and then.
Mhm.
So option 7, I would just add community feedback to that agenda item.
And
Well, and you're
and
gonna
a lot
take the
more time.
action off, right?
No, 10 minutes is all we have.
Okay.
Yeah, and take action off.
Well,
Should you
before-
put possible action or something sort of, I mean, I don't know how this,
I think you can leave action. I mean, if you don't take
Conversation's
action,
gonna
then
go. Yeah, that's
fine.
Okay.
But if you are in a situation where you're prepared to do so, then
I just want to be
Be pro-
sensitive not to mislead the community. If our
That's the
goal is
thing.
to be thoughtful and debate
Yeah.
and kind of position ourselves for
Your choice.
action later, I don't want to confuse people that are
Yeah.
I think
coming.
if you.
I would take action off.
Yeah,
I
don't
would,
think- I
because
don't think it should be warned for action.
I got some thoughtful people that are not
I think
nodding
you get
yes,
more
let's-
participation if you put action on it.
That's so devious.
Fair.
Okay.
Elizabeth Marketing Fitzgerald. we call her.
Yes, exactly.
Martin, do you have an opinion, sir?
I mean, I think we should say, I think we should say action as well. I mean,
You have to vote, Pat, because it's 2-2.
Jeez. I would take action off.
I'm sorry, we zoomed past city and school collaboration. It occurs to me, though, that the following week we have a steering committee meeting. Is there anything that we do need to talk about, not as an update from city school collaboration, but
Oh,
is
the
there any?
agenda.
Do we need to talk about the agenda, or is that set some other way before we come to that meeting?
That's a fair point. Yeah, we should probably leave it on there for a few minutes and
Well,
help set the
that,
agenda. I
that
think that'll
agenda will
work
have
with
to have
Helen
been
and I.
finalized because it
And
has to
sent.
be warned.
Well, we have to hear that you guys can attend first.
Can we
We
do
don't
the
know if you're
agenda?
12th or
Can we
13th.
add things
can
to
do
the
both.
agenda by
I'm
email?
good with
Yeah,
both.
yeah.
That would be the better way to go.
What's that?
If we can
I'll work
go
with
over that
Helen
by email.
on
Yeah,
getting
we-
an agenda. We'll get it in email
I mean,
process.
some of
through
us,
David.
Yeah.
and we can provide it, but
Sound
maybe,
good?
yeah. So keep it on there just for, you want to.
I think what we're gonna try to do is try to get Helen and I, or you and Kevin, to draft an agenda, send it out, and then we'll edit back to you, and then you and I can finalize
So
the
you
two
can
of
keep
them.
this off there, or
So we
would you?
keep it off, because we don't
Okay.
need to discuss it.
Sorry.
No, it was a great point to bring up. We had to deal with that one. All right, superintendent's report, we'll keep on.
Mhm.
Negotiations. Given the amount of time we'll add for master planning, do you want to have these monitoring reports on?
Oh, what happened with that? Did you guys say that it didn't go black?
Might as well leave them on there if we can get to them, great. If not, or do you not
Well,
want
let
to?
me work with, you. I think I gotta take some of those off. You're gonna need some time here. We're not gonna be able to be. So let me look at then what I could move on these, policy monitoring
'Kay.
pieces.
We will leave
'Cause I
them.
mean, I think honestly, you're gonna need probably the same amount of time that you had tonight. Maybe not as much, maybe an hour and a half, though.
Yeah, no, I
I
agree.
put it
We're
over.
gonna
Yeah.
need some time.
So I'll work with, we'll rework it. I'll work with Delana.
Okay. Evaluation will leave on, send the agenda, future agenda items. Looks good. Any other comments or suggestions? All right. Anything under future agenda items that people want to bring up?
The only one I wanted to add is we have a group of our alumni that's a very active group. They're called the Rebel Reach. I'm not exactly sure of their year. Do you know their year that they're, I think they're approaching their 50th year.
1967.
Oh, I
Yes,
know
so thank
some of
you.
these
And
people in
so
this group.
I thought
I know.
I thought it'd be great in the spirit of just doing some connect. They have been working very diligently with the upcoming graduating class is going to graduate the same year as their 50th.
They are
And
awesome.
so they've been doing a lot on engagement with the
Yeah.
students and participation. I thought it would be nice for them to do some. So the 21st of September, I'd love to invite them.
That'd be great.
And so but if that doesn't work, we can put them on a different, but I think it's a good time frame to do it maybe.
That's actually on the heels, I think, of a walk they do
Yeah.
together, the two classes.
So if that works.
At Shelburne Museum.
And so anyway,
I
I
like it.
think it'd be nice to connect.
Okay. Anything else on future? Accounts payable orders, number 7, number 8, and Act 154 summer savings. I know there was one question that was posed and answered. It's at your desk or your table. Any other questions? Hearing none. Those are fine. Accounts payable order to Optiv Security in the amount of $83,000. Do you want to speak to that one, David?
No, it's part of our, it's part of the upgrades that we've been doing around our security, IT infrastructure. So it's been part of what we have in the approved budget. It's just because it's over the 50 again, same thing that we've talked about before.
Okay.
I move that we approve the accounts payable order check to Optiv Security, Inc. in the amount of $83,623.69.
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Wait, I have a discussion.
Sorry.
So this check's been issued
Mm-hmm.
as of August 11th.
Can I amend my motion to the
Well,
retroactively approve?
I guess from a process standpoint, if the policy requires that the board approve purchases over a certain amount, are we in violation because?
I think
this
it's
has been
because
paid?
this came to us at our last meeting, right?
Well, they cut the checks. They don't send them until I give the approval, or
Oh.
David gives the approval tomorrow morning.
So this check has not been sent?
No.
Oh, okay. There's the answer.
Has that answered my question?
There you go.
But I guess, just for,
Well, it is a little bit of an issue here around, we go to the voters, it's approved, these are projects approved. It's one of these kind of, I feel it's a little bit of a, not a trap, but a little bit, that it's approved by the voters, you've approved it, but yet, under policy governance, I'm not authorized. So either we figure out a different way to do this, where then the clerk would be signing off on those things that are over 50, or I'm out of compliance, you see?
Mhm.
So it's complicated, I think most other policy governance districts are just saying, just ignore that. They have it written that for anything over 50, but these pre-approved bonded projects don't fall into that. But I think it's good oversight,
Mhm.
and I think we can do it this way, it's right. But in some cases where time constraints are tight like this,
Yeah.
then should it be a deferment to the clerk in the absence of the rotation of a board meeting? So,
So
you
is
know,
this
'cause we could
payment
at
gonna be
some-
late?
It's close, but I think most people understand.
Yeah, due date's 8/20.
Yeah,
There was a conversation about this.
yeah. So again,
Let's put that on the future agenda items.
how you want
As
to
far
do
as
it.
how
I think
do
we
that.
can
I think right
procedurally,
now's not the time to decide that.
procedurally we come up with something different probably.
So can we deal with that when that monitoring report comes up?
Yeah,
Is it
financial.
two financial assets or
Yeah.
conditions?
Is that, do you want to do it sooner than that, or
We'll
is
do
that
it and then we
reasonable?
work with John Aubin on how to
Find a way
figure
to
that
find,
out. It may be that we stay with this.
serve
and-
both
and just-
masters there.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's a motion and a second. There's been some discussion. Any more discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes. Item number 16 on the agenda. Do I have a
I move to
motion?
adjourn.
I second.
Any opposed? All those in favor?
Aye.